There's a small gray alien hiding behind a tree in Colorado. It has been standing there since 1997, and the vast majority of people who watched the scene never once noticed it. They were watching four kids in winter coats argue about Christmas. The alien just stood there, patient and unhurried, tucked behind pine bark with its enormous almond eyes and its long, pale limbs, doing what it always does, waiting to be found by the right kind of viewer. That is the thing about South Park that doesn't get talked about enough. The show built its entire public reputation on being loud and brash and impossible to ignore, a cartoon so aggressively obvious about its intentions that it drew protests before its second episode aired, earned death threats from foreign extremist organizations, got banned by entire governments, and triggered official condemnations from the White House. None of those things happen to shows that are subtle. None of those things happen to shows that are trying to hide. And yet, running quietly underneath all of that noise, stitched into the fabric of the show's frames and audio tracks and numerical details and recurring visual motifs, is one of the most intricate and obsessive hidden detail traditions in the history of American animation. Trey Parker and Matt Stone spent nearly 3 decades slipping things into South Park that most viewers were never supposed to consciously notice. Numbers that decode into literary citations. Posters that carry private jokes across 12 uninterrupted seasons. Musical cues borrowed from their own college film projects, recognizable only to the handful of people who'd tracked down those projects. Film fight scenes rebuilt shot for shot with such precision that the reference sits inside the episode like a message in a bottle, waiting for the one viewer in 100 who would recognize it. Predictions embedded in throwaway gags that only became legible years later. When reality arrived at the address, the joke had been standing outside. This video is about all of that. Every layer, every tradition, every rabbit hole that opens up when you watch South Park, not as a loud cartoon doing loud things, but as a carefully constructed object made by people who cared deeply about the difference between what was visible and what was hidden. We are going to go slowly tonight. There's no rush. This is an unhurried walk through nearly 3 decades of one of the most densely layered animation universes ever assembled for cable television. We're going to start at the very beginning, with the very first Easter egg the show ever planted, and we're going to follow the threads forward through time, all the way to the present, until we've found everything worth finding. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down if you want. This is going to take a while. Part 1. The Visitors, South Park's Hidden Alien Army. The story of South Park's Easter egg tradition begins before the show existed in any form you'd recognize, before it had a network, before it had a contract, before the 4 boys who would eventually be named Stan and Kyle and Cartman and Kenny had settled into the personalities that would define them. It begins in 1992, with 2 film students at the University of Colorado making things out of construction paper and glue and hoping someone would find them funny. The alien in question is a gray. The classic kind. Large almond-shaped eyes, oversized cranium, limbs that suggest something designed for efficiency rather than beauty. The kind of figure you'd find on a late 1990s Area 51 souvenir shop magnet, the kind that populated millions of middle school binders and bedroom posters during the decade when alien abduction was mainstream entertainment. In South Park's internal mythology, these creatures are referred to as the Visitors. They made their very first appearance in the pilot episode, which aired on the 13th of August, 1997. The episode titled, Cartman Gets an Anal Probe. The connection to alien visitors is, obviously, embedded in that title. The visitors are the ones who take Cartman up into their ship at the start of the episode and implant a device in him that causes him to emit fire from his backside at irregular and deeply inconvenient intervals throughout the rest of the fire. Story. They're the inciting event of the series, the reason things get started. If the show had simply moved on after the pilot, if the visitors had served their narrative purpose and retreated back to wherever alien abductors go when they're not probing animated children in Colorado, they would be nothing more than a plot device, a season 1 gag, something that got the story going and then disappeared. Instead, someone on the South Park animation team made a decision that would generate more dedicated fan research than almost any other choice in the show's history. They decided that the visitors would never quite leave. They would just become very hard to see. Starting from the very next episode after the pilot, and continuing with quiet persistence through the first several seasons and beyond. Gray aliens began appearing in the backgrounds of scenes that had absolutely nothing to do with alien visitors, not prominently, not in ways designed to call attention to themselves. They were simply there, tucked into the edges of crowd scenes, peeking around the sides of buildings, sitting at town hall meetings wearing hats and scarves, like ordinary South Park residents who happened to have large heads and no visible nose. They stood in bushes. They appeared in windows of buildings. The camera moved past at normal speed. They hid behind cars and trees and furniture. They were present in a way that only became visible if you were specifically looking for them, and most people had no idea to look. The rumor that spread through early South Park fandom moving through school hallways and early internet message boards and the comment sections of fan sites that were, by internet standards of the era, rudimentary but passionate, was that every single episode contained at least one alien. Every single one, without exception, hidden somewhere in every frame of every installment of every season. It was the kind of story that spread because it gave people something to do with the show beyond watching it. It transformed passive consumption into active searching, turned re-watching old episodes into a treasure hunt. You could be watching South Park casually, getting the jokes, following the story, and simultaneously be missing an entire parallel game that was always going on in the background. The reality, when it eventually became possible to verify it through systematic analysis, turned out to be slightly less absolute than the rumor suggested, but no less impressive for the adjustment. When fans wrote to South Park Studios directly, the FAQ responses confirmed that the visitors appeared in roughly over half of all episodes, but acknowledged that the animators themselves had never kept precise count of the appearances. They don't have exact numbers. The tradition grew organically from the initial joke and became a practice within the production, something individual animators would contribute to their backgrounds, almost as a personal gesture toward an ongoing shared mystery. Because they didn't maintain records, the exact total became the subject of dedicated fan investigation that has continued for the entirety of the show's run. What dedicated researchers found, episode by episode, with screenshots and timestamps, and the particular patience that only comes from genuine enthusiasm for a very specific task, is remarkable in its scope. The visitors don't restrict themselves to crowd shots or exterior establishing scenes. They find their way into the most unexpected corners of the frame. In the early seasons, catalogers found aliens hiding behind Jimbo's guns, a background establishment that appears in outdoor scenes. They found them in the school gymnasium, occupying chairs during assemblies. They found them floating in pools, which is perhaps the most relaxed and human behavior you could attribute to an extraterrestrial visitor, just lounging in the shallow end of a residential pool like a neighbor who wandered over. They appeared in bushes in the background of outdoor conversations, only partially visible, the way someone half hidden in vegetation appears in a photograph you don't notice until you zoom in. They rode as chauffeurs in limousines. They stood at the backs of crowd scenes during town hall meetings, listening attentively to whatever Randy Marsh was apologizing for this week. They showed up on mugs, actual individual coffee mugs, sitting on tables, in scenes where nobody was looking at the mug, requiring the kind of pause and zoom approach to viewing that the average first-time watcher would never employ. One of the most frequently cited sightings involves a Jesus reflection in a mirror that, for a fraction of a second, reshapes itself into the silhouette of a visitor. This one divided the fan community. Was it intentional? An Easter egg hidden within an already religiously inflected scene? Or was it an animation artifact, a coincidence produced by the limited precision of the digital tools used to create the show in its early seasons? The animators never confirmed or denied it, which is exactly the kind of equivocal response that keeps an Easter egg community alive and searching. Some fans compiled their findings into comprehensive illustrated guides, episode by episode, with timestamps and cropped screenshots showing exactly where in each frame the visitor could be found. These guides became community documents, shared and updated, and corrected as new eyes found things earlier investigators had missed. The guides were also never complete, because the show kept producing new episodes and the game kept going. The scale of the community that grew around finding these aliens is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it says something important about the relationship between the show and its most dedicated viewers. South Park built a significant portion of its cultural footprint on being outrageous and provocative, on generating controversy, and attracting the kind of attention that came from doing things other shows wouldn't do. That was the public face. But the hidden alien tradition attracted a completely different kind of devotion, quiet, methodical, obsessive, in the particular way that puzzle-solving obsession operates, finding satisfaction not in shock or controversy, but in the small private triumph of locating a thing that was designed to be hard to locate. The same show generated both kinds of attention simultaneously. The loud show and the quiet game coexisted within every episode. Comedy Central eventually formalized the game. In 2009, they held a promotional contest, asking viewers to find the hidden aliens in the first 7 episodes of Season 12. Prizes were offered. The contest was announced and promoted through the show's official channels. This was, in a sense, the network acknowledging something that had been running for 12 years without acknowledgement, recognizing the tradition publicly, turning the private game into an official feature. It also revived the alien appearances in a season that brought them back after they'd become significantly rarer in the show's middle era. The tradition that had tapered off was being deliberately restored, which meant someone at the production level was aware of it and cared about its continuation. In the cafeteria of South Park Elementary, visible in numerous episodes across many seasons in the background of cafeteria scenes, there is a poster on the wall. The poster depicts the face of a gray alien, the visitor's unmistakable, large-eyed silhouette, and beneath the face, in the format of a missing persons flyer, it reads, "Have you seen me?" It is an Easter egg that references other Easter eggs. The poster is acknowledging the game from inside the universe that contains the game, making the hidden tradition visible as an institution within the fiction, while simultaneously being one of the things you're supposed to find. It is the game commenting on itself without breaking. A missing persons flyer for the creatures that everyone is looking for, placed in the background of the room where everyone goes to eat lunch, where it sits and waits to be noticed by the viewer, who happens to be scanning the background of a cafeteria scene, rather than listening to whatever conversation is happening in the foreground. There is something almost meditative about hunting for the visitors across multiple episodes. It requires a particular quality of attention that most entertainment doesn't ask of its audience, a soft focus on the background rather than the sharpened focus on the foreground, an attention that is present but not urgent, patient but not passive. You have to not quite watch normally in order to see these things. You have to let your eyes drift to the edges of the frame, into the spaces where the story isn't happening, and look for what shouldn't be there. It's a different relationship with the material than most viewing offers, and it generates a different kind of experience, quieter, slower, more interior. The Visitors have become, in the 3 decades of the show's run, one of its most enduring institutional traditions. They're not jokes in the conventional sense. They don't have punchlines. They don't advance stories or develop characters. They are simply there, in the corners of frames, patient and still, for the viewers who look. If you're watching this right now, wherever you are, drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. I genuinely love knowing where these videos end up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the button is right there. It's 2 seconds, and it means a great deal to the channel. Part 2. The opening credits. A treasure map. Nobody fully checked. Every episode of South Park begins the same way, and has begun the same way for close to 3 decades. A voice that belongs to Les Claypool, the distinctive bass player and singer of the band Primus, announces over a simple, folk-inflected melody that he is going down to South Park to have himself a time. 2 voices you recognize as Stan and Kyle respond that there are friendly faces everywhere and humble folks without temptation. The music builds. The camera moves through the mountain town, establishing the geography of the place, showing the school and the mountain peaks and the sky above. And then the last chorus falls and the episode begins. Most people have watched this opening sequence a great many times without really listening to it. That's natural, and it's not a criticism. Theme songs are designed to be half absorbed. They run while you settle in, find your comfortable position, get your phone put away, prepare for the 22 minutes ahead. The theme is doing its job when it registers at the level of recognition rather than analysis. You know the show has started. That's enough. But if you actually listen to the South Park opening, and specifically if you track what changes between seasons and what hides within the animation, You discover that the credits have been operating as a miniature Easter egg delivery system for almost 3 decades. They contain multiple layers of content, some obvious, some requiring real attention, some almost impossible to access without supplemental research. The opening of every episode is itself an act of concealment, dressed as familiarity. Start with Kenny. Kenny McCormick speaks throughout every episode in a thick, muffled, entirely unintelligible voice, produced by the hood of his orange parka pulling tightly against his face. It is one of the show's foundational running gags, the character who is always present, always talking, never once clearly heard. This extends to the opening sequence. Kenny has his own verse in the Primus theme, delivered in the same impenetrable muffle that characterizes everything he says. You can hear that he's saying something. The shape of words is there, but the specific content is designed to be unrecoverable through casual listening. Here is what makes this an Easter egg rather than simply a design quirk. The line Kenny sings is deliberately vulgar, profoundly so, by the standards of what can be broadcast on cable television, and it changes between seasons. Parker and Stone essentially engineered a mechanism for saying things that would ordinarily trigger a broadcast standards review, by making those things impossible to understand. The muffling that appears to be the character's limitation is actually the show's loophole. You can't bleep what can't be parsed, and you can't have a standards complaint upheld about content that no reviewer can definitively prove is there. The unintelligible delivery was the permission slip. The censors tool became the tool for circumventing censorship. The unaired pilot episode, the one made before the show, had a network deal, had Kenny singing something relatively mild about the town. Once the show went to broadcast in seasons 1 and 2, the line changed to something involving Kenny's appreciation for a particular anatomical attribute. The exact lyrics have been confirmed through enough analysis and insider acknowledgement that they're well established among fans, and they are absolutely not something that could have been approved for broadcast in their clear form. The muffling allowed them to exist in plain hearing distance of millions of viewers for years, without generating the kind of documented complaint that would require a formal response. Seasons 3 through 5 brought a different line, also graphic, this time of a different nature, referencing Kenny's own physical characteristics and suggesting a use for them. Season 6, the season when Kenny was dead and absent from the show, as a regular character, a bold experiment in continuity that didn't entirely work, but produced interesting television, saw his slot in the theme taken over by Timmy. Timmy's line was simply his own name, repeated with escalating enthusiasm. Timmy, 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 living a lie, Timmy. It was the most legible verse any character ever sang in the opening. Fully comprehensible, impossible to mistake, and funny, precisely because it was so earnest and so entirely unlike what surrounded it. Timmy was not trying to hide anything. Timmy had nothing to hide. Kenny returned in season 7 with a line specifically referencing a desire to do something to a specific famous pop star, who was at that point everywhere in popular culture simultaneously. This version ran through season 10, at which point it changed to the current version, a line that has remained in place from roughly the middle of season 10 through the most recent episodes, which concerns Kenny's self-reported enthusiasm about a particular category of person, phrased in the kind of specific and anatomical language that benefits significantly from the orange parka's noise-canceling effect. The whole thing was never officially confirmed or denied for years. Parker and Stone answered questions about Kenny's lyrics with the kind of plausible deniability that allowed them to maintain the game. By the time enough evidence existed to establish definitively what Kenny was saying in each era, it had been running long enough that it felt less like a scandal and more like one of the show's endearing institutional eccentricities. The subversiveness had aged into charm, but Kenny's muffled verse is not the only thing worth paying attention to in the opening credits. The animation itself contains information, hidden in the crowd in the background, with the same careful placement as the alien Easter eggs elsewhere in the show. In versions of the opening that ran through the middle and later seasons of the show, if you pause at the right moment during the crowd shot near Skeeter's bar and Cocktails the Rough, wood-paneled establishment that serves as South Park's working-class bar and has appeared throughout the show's run, you can find a specific figure lurking beside the building, partially obscured by the pine trees at the building's edge, wearing a distinctive and recognizable costume. That figure is Al Gore. He is dressed as Man-Bear-Pig. For this to land properly, you need some history. Man-Bear-Pig is a creature that Al Gore warned the children of South Park about in the 2006 season 10 episode bearing the creature's name. In that episode, Gore was depicted as a desperate and self-aggrandizing figure, using an invented monster part man, part bear, part pig, as a vehicle for reclaiming public attention after his 2000 presidential loss. The creature was a metaphor, and a not particularly subtle one, for what Parker and Stone viewed at the time as Gore's tendency toward theatrical climate change advocacy. They thought he was overstating the danger, manufacturing urgency for personal relevance, and they made an episode saying so. Parker and Stone later revisited this with considerable candor and essentially admitted they'd been wrong. In 2018, Man-Bear-Pig returned to South Park as a real and devastating threat, and the boys apologized to Al Gore for not believing him. The course correction is one of the more remarkable things the show has ever done, publicly, in-universe, using the show's own characters to acknowledge a factual error rather than simply moving on from it. But between the original 2006 episode and the 2018 correction, Gore as Man-Bear-Pig had accumulated enough affectionate presence in the show's mythology that someone decided he deserved to be hidden in the opening credits, watching over the town he'd been trying to warn for more than a decade. To find him there, lurking behind the trees in the background of the crowd shot, requires enough familiarity with the Man-Bear-Pig episodes to recognize the costume, enough attention to notice the figure by the building's edge at all, and enough synthesis to understand why it's funny, which requires holding multiple seasons of narrative simultaneously. It is a reward designed for a specific kind of viewer, and it is the purest form of Easter egg the opening contains. The credits have also evolved visually in ways that become striking when you watch episodes from different eras. The very earliest seasons have a rougher, more obviously paper-based quality. The animation is less fluid, the character movements more limited, the color palette simpler. As the seasons progressed and the production became more sophisticated, the opening smoothed out considerably, the animation growing more polished, the overall quality increasing in ways that are genuinely visible to anyone watching closely. This seems obvious to say, but the interesting thing is that the aesthetic simplicity was always a choice rather than a limitation. The show can produce much more fluid animation when it wants to, and the deliberate maintenance of the rough, childish-looking style throughout the opening is itself a statement. Every season, they could have decided to update the aesthetic more substantially. They chose not to. The look was the identity. Some of this evolution is documented, in which characters appear in the opening's crowd sequences. The version of the credits that has been in use since roughly season 17 is not an exactly accurate census of the show's current cast. Principal Victoria, who was abruptly replaced by PC Principal in season 19's storyline, appears in the current opening. Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, who was controversially written out of the show in season 22, during an episode with direct parallels to real-world cancellation dynamics, also appears. Characters who have been central to the show since season 19, PC Principal himself, Strong Woman, the various PC babies, are absent. The opening preserved a specific moment in the show's history, and everything since then has happened outside its frame. It functions as a kind of fossil record, a snapshot of who was in the universe at a particular moment, with all subsequent additions and subtractions visible only by their absence. For the show's 25th anniversary in 2022, the Primus theme was re-recorded with a full orchestral arrangement. This version was performed live as part of the anniversary concert, and it treated the folk melody with genuine seriousness, a sweeping arrangement that honored the song by taking it a direction the original recording would never have suggested. In this orchestral version, Kenny's muffled line was sung by a full choir, clearly, without the parka's distortion, in the original season 1 and 2 lyrics. It was the only moment in the show's history when the hidden content of that verse was made explicit for a general audience. A quarter-century of careful unintelligibility, solved briefly before the veil came back down. The Goth Kids episode Dawn of the Posers from season 17 delivered a completely different kind of opening credit Easter egg, a total replacement of the standard theme with a new version designed to reflect episode's focus on South Park's small but passionate goth community. In this version, the upbeat folk theme is replaced with something minor key and atmospheric, the cheerful Colorado imagery replaced with darker visuals, and the lyrics shifted into a genuine parody of goth sensibility. The line, "I'm going down to South Park, gonna leave my woes behind," became something about going to South Park to die. The boys' friendly faces everywhere verse became something appropriately bleak. It was a fully committed alternate opening that worked as both comedy and as genuine music, the kind of thing you could listen to on its own terms, rather than just as a joke about goths being dramatic. That version of the opening only exists in that one episode and has never been reused. It is, in that sense, the rarest Easter egg in the credits tradition, a complete substitution that you'd only ever encounter if you happen to be watching that specific episode, and that rewards recognition of the original sufficiently to understand exactly what's being parodied. Part 3. The Braniff Ending Card, an accident that became legend. For 9 years, every episode of South Park ended the same unusual way. After the last scene, after the final credit roll, there was a brief card that would normally display a production company logo, the standard 20 or so seconds that network television has always used to identify who made the show. For South Park, this card was old commercial footage from a defunct airline, a Boeing 727 catching the light against a clean sky, the word Braniff appearing in red. Below it, "Believe It." And over the whole thing, a cheerful 12-note melody played on xylophone, jaunty and slightly too bright, the kind of sound you'd expect from a children's show, rather than the concluding punctuation of an episode that had probably just featured a fairly graphic death or a deeply uncomfortable satire of something the audience cared about. The strangeness of this card became, for an entire generation of South Park viewers, the sound and image of the show ending. Millions of people watched that plane bank against that blue sky and heard that little melody without knowing what either of them meant, filing the card away as one of the show's many inexplicable quirks. It felt like South Park off-brand, confident in its own oddness, not bothering to explain itself. The explanation, when you find it, is even better than the mystery. Braniff International Airways was a real American airline. It was founded in 1928, built a significant presence in the domestic and international market through the mid-20th century, pioneered some genuinely interesting visual design during the 1960s, when the company hired the designer Alexander Gerard to give the fleet a distinctive look, and then collapsed in a spectacular financial implosion in 1982. The airline industry of that era was brutal to carriers that had overextended themselves, and Braniff was one of the casualties. There was a brief revival attempt called New Braniff in 1991, which managed about a year of operation before failing as well. After that, the Braniff name and brand existed in a legal gray area, owned somewhere, not being actively used for anything. By 1997, Braniff was a piece of recent history, recent enough that people of Parker and Stone's generation remembered seeing it, old enough that it existed mainly as archive footage. When Parker and Stone delivered the pilot episode of South Park to Comedy Central in 1997, they had a problem that is easy to overlook, but essential to the origin story. They didn't have a production company. Most television deliveries include a bumper, that brief card at the end, identifying the production entity responsible for the show. An independent production company would have a logo. Parker and Stone, at that moment, had a show, but not yet the corporate structure around it. They needed something to put at the end of the pilot. The account of what happened next varies slightly in different tellings, but the core of it is consistent. There was a VHS tape in the production space. On that tape, mixed in with other footage, was an old Braniff commercial. Whether it had been recorded over accidentally, whether it was a tape someone had kept for reasons nobody remembered, whether it just happened to be sitting in reach when they needed something, the tape was there, and the Braniff footage was on it, and they used it. A defunct airline's commercial became the production card for what would become the most controversial cartoon in television history. Comedy Central, receiving the pilot, apparently watched the Braniff card and concluded it was either intentional or close enough to intentional that it didn't matter. The card stayed. The pilot aired with it. And then it appeared at the end of the second episode, and the third, and eventually Parker and Stone received contact from the company that owned the rights to the Braniff name and brand. Rather than a legal challenge, what followed was an arrangement. They could continue using the footage and the logo on South Park broadcasts in exchange for acknowledgement. They formalized this by naming their production company Braniff Productions. The accident became the institution. An airline that nobody was flying anymore became the official brand of the most talked-about show on cable. None of that, though, explains the music. The 12-note xylophone melody that plays over the Braniff card is not a Braniff Airlines jingle. It has nothing to do with the airline. It is, in fact, the melody from Spadoinkle Day, a song from Trey Parker's 1996 film Cannibal, the musical. This film was Parker's final project at the University of Colorado, a comedic retelling of the true story of Alfred Packer, a 19th-century frontiersman convicted of murder and cannibalism in Colorado, told as a cheerful musical with original songs. It was shot on a shoestring budget, had very limited distribution, and was seen by a small enough audience that most people who eventually became South Park fans had no idea it existed. Spadoinkle Day is the film's signature musical number, an exuberantly cheerful song about the pleasures of a beautiful morning. The sky is blue and all the leaves are green. The sun's as warm as a baked potato. It is the kind of song that achieves humor through the total sincerity with which it approaches its own sunniness, and its melody was apparently lodged so firmly in Parker's creative memory that it became the natural choice for the jingle at the end of every episode of his television show. He gave his first feature film's signature song to what he probably assumed was a temporary placeholder card, and then the placeholder became permanent, and suddenly millions of people were hearing the cannibal. The musical melody at the end of every South Park episode, without knowing that's what they were hearing, for the extremely small initial audience of Cannibal. The musical, this was a private treasure. Every time an episode ended, and that melody played, they were hearing something that connected the two projects, that established a through line between Parker's college filmmaking and his television work. The Braniff card was, for them, a coded communication. This show was made by the same person who made that film, and that history is present in every episode, right at the end, every time. There are variations in the Braniff card across the show's run that are worth knowing about. The unaired pilot, the version made for Comedy Central's initial presentation before the series was formally commissioned, features a completely different card from the broadcast version. In place of the 727 footage, there are 6 men performing a chorus line dance in black and white. They are wearing very little clothing. A black bar of censorship covers the relevant details, and the text Braniff Airlines appears over them, followed by in conjunction with. The 6 participants are identified in production lore as members of the early South Park production circle, including Eric Stow, Adrian Beard, Diane Botcher, Matt Stone, and Trey Parker, with Parker appearing as a clown. Also present, according to the documentation, is Mike Judge, the creator of Beavis and Butthead, who was part of their creative social world at that time. This version of the card is essentially a document of the people who made South Park before it was South Park, the production team, as a social group, performing an absurdist bit for a pilot they were delivering to a network, not knowing whether the network would say yes or whether anyone would ever see this particular card again. It has the energy of something made entirely for the amusement of the people making it, with no expectation of audience. It's the show's prehistory, captured in 30 seconds of black and white footage. The Season 2 episode Chicken Pox carries a variant Braniff melody. In this single episode, the closing card plays not with the Spadoinkle Day tune, but with a melody notably similar to the Monkees' I'm a Believer. This variant was reportedly composed by Peter Tork, the Monkees' bassist, making the connection deliberate rather than coincidental. It appeared once and never again. The reason for its appearance in this specific episode, rather than any other, has never been formally explained. It sits in the run of episodes as a single anomaly, a one-episode experiment with a different musical texture that was apparently found wanting, or perhaps simply noted and moved past. The Season 10 episode, The Return of Chef, one of the most emotionally complicated episodes in the show's history, made after Isaac Hayes had left the show, and executed in a way that was simultaneously a farewell to the character and a brutal critique of Scientology's role. In Hayes' departure features a silent version of the Braniff card, no melody. The 727 footage plays as it always does. The text appears, but there is no jingle. The silence is abrupt and a little disorienting if you've heard the same 12 notes at the end of hundreds of episodes. Whether the silence was a deliberate mourning gesture for the chef character or simply a production decision made under the pressured circumstances of that particular episode has never been confirmed, but it is noticed. It has always been noticed. And in context, it lands like a held breath. After season 10, the Braniff card disappeared. Parker Stone Studios adopted a different production identifier, and 9 years of a defunct airline's commercial footage came to an end. For viewers who'd watched from the beginning, the disappearance of the card was quietly significant, a minor structural change that nonetheless marked the end of something. The show continued, but the airline went away, and the little melody that had been Spadoinkle Day in disguise stopped playing at the end of everyone's evening. Part 4. Parker and Stone's Fingerprints Orgasmo, DVDA, and the Art of Continuous Self-Reference. In 1997, the year South Park premiered, Trey Parker released his second feature film. It was called Orgasmo, and it received an NC-17 rating from the MPAA, which was given its content, essentially inevitable. The film follows a naive Mormon missionary who is discovered by an adult film director, becomes the star of a superhero-themed adult franchise while hiding his new career from his fiancée, and eventually has to use his film persona's abilities to confront actual crime. It's funny. It also involves explicit content rendered with the kind of low-budget earnestness that all Parker films from this era possess, and the MPAA responded to this combination by ensuring it couldn't be shown to anyone under 17 in any mainstream theater. The film made very little money. Critics were largely indifferent or lightly amused. Its distribution was limited. The audience who saw it in 1997 was modest. By most conventional measures of commercial and critical success, Orgasmo was a minor failure that should have receded quietly into the catalog of ambitious but overlooked indie comedies and been forgotten. Parker and Stone never allowed it to be forgotten. Beginning in the very first episode of South Park, a poster for Orgasmo is visible on the back of Cartman's bedroom door. Not prominent, not centered in the frame, but there, visible from the right angle when the camera shows us that side of that room. The poster features the Orgasmo superhero character in his distinctive costume, and it sits on Cartman's door with the absolute confidence of something that has always been there and always will be. The poster stayed. Episode after episode, season after season, whenever a shot showed us the inside of Cartman's room at the right angle, the Orgasmo poster was there. For the first 12 seasons of the show, from 1997 through roughly 2008, Cartman's bedroom had an Orgasmo poster on the back of the door. This is not a detail that most viewers tracked consciously. It was background furniture, something that registered peripherally, if it registered at all. But the decision to keep it there for 12 consecutive seasons, through hundreds of episodes, across storylines that had absolutely nothing to do with Trey Parker's NC-17 Mormon adult film, is a commitment to a private joke of breathtaking duration. The Orgasmo connection is older than South Park. In the 1995 Spirit of Christmas short, the second Spirit of Christmas short, the one Brian Graydon commissioned for $2,000 that went viral before South Park existed, the Jesus vs. Santa Claus one, there is a statue. During the fight between Jesus and Santa Claus, as the two figures engage in the kind of brutal physical combat that would define the short's humor, a statue is knocked over and falls on Kenny, killing him. That statue is of Orgasmo's superhero character. It is Kenny's first death in the property that would become South Park, and it is caused by a falling icon of a film that wouldn't be released for 2 more years. The Orgasmo connection, in other words, precedes even the show, embedded in the founding document of the whole enterprise. Beyond the poster, Orgasmo has what might be called a trophy life in the South Park universe. The figure of the Orgasmo character, arms extended, cape in motion, the posture of heroic flight, appears as a trophy or decorative object in multiple episodes and multiple contexts. In an awards ceremony featuring Kathy Lee Gifford, the trophy given out at the ceremony is the Orgasmo figure. When the boys win a dodgeball championship in an early season, the trophy they receive is the Orgasmo character. This is a deeply specific joke. The highest honor available in the South Park universe is a trophy shaped like the protagonist of Trey Parker's NC-17 Mormon porn action film. It's a joke that only fully lands if you know what orgasmo is, and most of the audience, at any given moment, doesn't. That doesn't seem to have troubled anyone involved. The musical reach of the orgasmo reference is also worth noting. In the Season 1 episode, Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride, an episode that was nominated for a GLAAD Award for its genuinely compassionate portrayal of a gay character, which is remarkable context for a 1997 South Park episode. The end credits include a brief musical cue that belongs to the orgasmo theme, a few seconds easily missed, but unmistakably from the film for anyone who knows it. DVDA is Parker and Stone's band. The name is a deeply explicit acronym that refers to a specific variety of content from the adult entertainment industry. The band performed real music, including Now You're a Man, the driving, earnest power ballad that serves as Orgasmo's opening theme, and that is the most recognizably out-of-place thing in the film's audio landscape. They also recorded What Would Brian Boitano Do?, which became the opening song of the South Park movie's alternate sequence. In the Season 2 episode, Clubhouses, the episode in which Stan and Kyle's parents are divorcing and the boys construct their respective clubhouses to cope, one of the girls who comes to visit is wearing a black t-shirt. On the shirt, printed in plain text, are the letters DVDA. Most viewers who noticed the shirt assumed it was a generic design element or a reference to something they didn't know. It is, in fact, the band's name Parker and Stone, embedding their actual musical project's name in a background costume detail, with full knowledge that their band's acronym could appear on a child's shirt on cable television, precisely because most of the audience would not know what the letters meant. The ones who did know were getting a very different joke from the ones who didn't. Cannibal, the musical, Parker's 1996 first feature, threads through South Park in ways more numerous than the Braniff melody alone. Specific musical phrases from the film show up in show episodes, recognizable to people who have spent time with the film's soundtrack. References to the Alfred Packer story, the real Colorado history, that Parker adapted for the film, appear in the show's universe in ways that acknowledge the earlier work. The general aesthetic vocabulary of Cannibal, the musical, its particular brand of cheerful absurdism pushed against genuine darkness, is the direct ancestor of the same combination in South Park, and knowing the film helps you trace the lineage of specific comedic choices. Basketball, the 1998 film that Parker and Stone appeared in as actors under the direction of David Zucker, gets a brief cameo in the Season 3 episode, Spontaneous Combustion. Randy Marsh is watching television, and in the background of the scene, for approximately 2 seconds, the television is playing footage from basketball. This is not a moment the episode needs. It doesn't advance the story. It is purely an act of self-citation, a small gesture toward the parallel project they were doing at the time, recognizable only to the small number of viewers who had seen both basketball and had either paused their South Park viewing at the right moment or had unusually fast eyes. The compulsive self-referencing across Parker and Stone's filmography suggests something important about how they think about their work. They seem to resist the idea of their projects being fully separate from each other. Each new thing they make carries traces of the previous things, deliberately embedded. The Orgasmo poster on Cartman's door for 12 seasons is an extreme version of this, but it's continuous with a broader habit of keeping their creative history alive and present in whatever they're currently making. It's not nostalgia, exactly. It's more like continuity, the sense that all the things they've made share a universe. That the man who sang Spadoinkle Day in a Colorado student film and the man who created a show that attracted White House condemnation are the same person, and the work reflects that. Part 5. Numbers that aren't random hidden codes, embedded in the show. South Park has, scattered throughout its run, with what appears to be deliberate irregularity, a habit of making numbers carry meaning beyond their face value. These aren't ciphers waiting to be decoded in the puzzle-solving sense. They are allusions, literary and cinematic citations delivered through the medium of numbers that most viewers absorb without interrogation, filed away as incidental detail, never questioned, because numbers and background details rarely warrant questions. The most celebrated instance of this appears in the Season 4 episode, Cartman's Silly Hate Crime, 2000. In the episode, Cartman is arrested for throwing a rock at Token Black and is convicted under hate crime statutes, sentenced to juvenile detention as a consequence. When he is processed into the reform school, when the administrator reads out his prisoner number for assignment, the number announced aloud, clearly, over dialogue, audible to anyone actually listening, is 24,601, 24601. That number does not come from nowhere. It is the prisoner number of Jean Valjean, the protagonist of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Valjean, imprisoned for stealing bread to feed his starving nephew, spends years of his life defined entirely by that number. It is what his jailers call him, what the obsessive Inspector Javert tracks him by, what the system reduces him to in the place of his humanity. The number 24601 is one of the most recognizable prisoner numbers in all of Western literature, familiar to anyone who has read the novel or seen any of its numerous stage and screen adaptations. Its appearance in South Park as Cartman's prison assignment is a literary Easter egg hidden inside an episode about Cartman being sent to jail for committing a hate crime against his black classmate. The juxtaposition carries some ironic charge. Valjean was a sympathetic figure punished unjustly by a system that criminalized poverty, while Cartman is an unreliable narrator of his own persecution who is at minimum partially culpable for his situation. But the reference doesn't require the irony to function. It's simply there for the viewer who knows Les Miserables, a brief, private signal from the production team to the literate portion of their audience. What makes this Easter egg even richer is the visual contradiction it contains. While the number 24601 is announced verbally, the number that is actually visible on the orange jumpsuit Cartman wears is different. That number, visible to anyone who paused the episode at the right moment, is 26354. And that number is also not arbitrary. It is the police identification number belonging to Rick Deckard in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, the 1982 science fiction film in which Harrison Ford plays a special detective called a Blade Runner, tasked with hunting down and retiring escaped replicant androids. Deckard's ID number is visible in the film during specific scenes, and someone working on the South Park episode transcribed it onto Cartman's uniform. So, a single gag, Cartman being processed into the juvenile detention system, delivers two separate literary and cinematic references through two different channels simultaneously. The audio carries Jean Valjean. The visual carries Rick Deckard. You'd need to be listening carefully enough to catch the spoken number and recognize the Les Miserables connection, and then you'd need to be watching carefully enough to freeze the frame and read the visible number and connect it to Blade Runner. Most viewers would catch neither in normal playback. The Easter egg required two forms of attention at the same time, directed at two different elements of the same brief moment. Blade Runner is a film the South Park production team returns to with notable frequency. In Cartman's Silly Hate Crime 2000, it supplies a prisoner number. In the post-COVID specials from 2021, set in a dystopian future South Park, it supplies a recurring visual. The famous geisha candy advertisement from Blade Runner, a towering neon display used in Scott's film as a marker of corporate dominance and Japanese cultural influence in a degraded future, Los Angeles appears on screens, above the imagined future South Park skyline. It appears more than once, in slightly varied form, in different scenes across the special, suggesting visual rhyming rather than a single throwaway reference. The show borrowed the aesthetic of Blade Runner's future and embedded it in the background of its own future, inviting the viewer who recognized it to see both futures at once and understand what the overlap was suggesting. The third significant number Easter egg lives in the Season 11 episode, D Yikes. In this episode, Mrs. Garrison, who at this point in the timeline had transitioned to a woman, visits a lesbian bar called Les Beaux. The bar's address, visible on its exterior signage, is 13280. If you type 13280 on a pocket calculator, and then invert the device so the display is upside down, the numbers form a word that is an obvious variation of the bar's name. This is a calculator joke specifically, the kind of calculator joke that occupied the minds of children and teenagers during the era when pocket calculators were common in schools. And people discovered that certain numbers, inverted, produced recognizable words or letters. The discovery that 7,734 inverted produces hell, or that 5318008 inverted produces something anatomically descriptive, was a rite of passage in a specific era of adolescent entertainment. Parker and Stone, who grew up in that era, embedded the calculator joke in a bar's address on a television show broadcast decades later, a small act of nostalgia for a kind of humor that has essentially no presence in contemporary culture. The relationship between South Park's episode numbers and the milestones they mark is another layer of numerical Easter egg, this one more structural than hidden. Episode 200 and Episode 201. The two-part spectacular from Season 14 were deliberately calibrated as celebratory summations of the show's history, and the episode numbers were not incidental to that design. Making 2 episodes out of the milestone, rather than a single special at 200, was itself a choice about wanting to give the celebration room. The number mattered. The show had reached a milestone that warranted recognition, and the recognition was built into the story in ways that required you to know the numbers to fully understand what you were seeing. Every celebrity the show had ever mocked, returning to file a lawsuit, is funnier and more resonant if you understand that this is specifically the 200th episode, that the accumulation the episode celebrates is a real and counted accumulation. Part 6. The Chewbacca Conspiracy Star Wars in Every Shadow. There is a rule in South Park. It is never explained, never acknowledged within the show's universe, and it operates without any formal announcement or editorial justification. The rule is this: somewhere in every Halloween episode, there is a Chewbacca costume. The tradition began in the very first Halloween episode the show produced, Season 1, Episode 7, Pink Eye, which aired on the 29th of October, 1997, barely 10 weeks after the series premiere. The episode is about Kenny being killed by the falling Mir space station, which came down on him at the bus stop, while the other boys watched with brief, quickly extinguished concern, and subsequently reanimated as a zombie through an embalming fluid accident involving Worcestershire sauce at the local morgue. The zombie rampage is the episode's main event, but the setup requires the boys to attend school in Halloween costumes, and Kyle arrives wearing a store-bought Chewbacca outfit that he's clearly invested some emotional energy in choosing. His emotional investment is immediately deflated. When the boys reach South Park Elementary, they discover that Kyle is not alone in his choice. Every student in the class has dressed as Chewbacca, every single one, including Mr. Hat, the hand puppet that Mr. Garrison uses as a teaching tool and confidant. Wendy Testaberger, who Stan had made a couple's costume agreement with, appears in a Chewbacca costume rather than the Raggedy Ann she was supposed to be, leaving Stan stranded in his Raggedy Andy outfit, looking precisely as defeated as you'd expect. The costume contest at the end of the episode is won by Wendy dressed as Chewbacca, like everyone else over Kenny's monstrous zombie state, which the judges interpret as an Edward James Olmos costume and award second place. The joke works on multiple levels simultaneously. It's a joke about the homogenizing effect of pop culture on individual self-expression. Everyone has the same idea, because everyone is working from the same cultural reference pool. It's a joke about the futility of Kyle's investment in his own costume's uniqueness. And in its specific choice of Chewbacca as the costume, it's a time-stamped cultural observation. In 1997, 2 months after the Star Wars Special Edition re-releases had renewed public enthusiasm for the franchise, Chewbacca is exactly the costume that every kid would choose. The choice to repeat the Chewbacca motif in subsequent Halloween episodes converted a one-episode gag into a running tradition. Season 2's Halloween episode, Korn's Groovy Pirate Ghost Mystery, includes Wendy winning a costume contest again in Chewbacca again over Kenny's elaborate and technically impressive robot costume, which performs actual functions and which loses nonetheless. The comedy of the recurrence is the inverse relationship between effort and recognition. Kenny builds a robot. Kenny loses to a Wookiee in a suit. This is justice of a South Park kind. In later seasons, the Chewbacca costume migrates from central costume to background detail. The Halloween crowd will include, somewhere in the frame, a figure in what is recognizably a Wookiee suit, a child trick-or-treating at the edges of a scene, a background party-goer, someone in a crowd shot during a school Halloween event, The tradition shifts from foreground joke to Easter egg, the kind of thing that makes the viewer who notices it feel rewarded, without making the viewer who misses it feel excluded. It's in the show's vocabulary now, a part of the annual celebration that doesn't need to be the episode's main event in order to be present. The Chewbacca tradition connects to a broader Star Wars presence in the show that extends across many episode types. In the Season 2 episode, Chef Aid, Johnny Cochran deploys what the episode calls the Chewbacca defense during a court case. The defense consists of standing before the jury and pointing out that Chewbacca is a Wookiee from the planet Kashyyyk, who inexplicably lives on the forest moon of Endor with Ewoks, and arguing that if this makes no sense, the jury must acquit. It is a parody of the O.J. Simpson trial, and specifically of Cochran's closing argument strategy, which many legal observers felt was designed to confuse and distract rather than engage with evidence directly. The episode's version crystallizes that feeling with characteristic exaggeration, and it also continues the Chewbacca thread outside of the Halloween context. The Star Wars engagement reaches its most direct form in the Season 6 episode, Free Hat, which is explicitly about Parker and Stone's feelings regarding George Lucas's habit of revising and re-releasing the Progress, original Star Wars trilogy, with digital editions and modifications. The episode positions the alteration of classic films as equivalent to child harm, an extreme position that nonetheless captures something real about the fan response to the special editions and the prequel modifications. Lucas and Spielberg are confronted directly in the episode's climax, forced to restore their original versions. The Wookiees' persistence across South Park's Halloween episodes is, in retrospect, a kind of love letter to a franchise that defined Parker and Stone's childhood cultural formation. Both men grew up in the late 1970s and 1980s, when Star Wars was not an established mythology, but an active cultural event that shaped what childhood looked like during that era. The Chewbacca costume isn't just a recurring gag. It's a recurring acknowledgement of where they came from, what their imaginations were built from, what their generation looks like when it chooses a Halloween costume. Part 7. Films Hidden in Plain Sight. The Deep Reference Tradition. South Park's parody tradition operates on a spectrum. At one end are the obvious, announced parodies episodes that openly declare themselves as versions of specific films, that put their references in the episode title, that expect the audience to recognize the source material because the recognition is the joke. At the other end are references embedded so precisely in the show's animation and dialogue structure that you'd need to have specific knowledge of the referenced work to realize what you were seeing at all. The most technically impressive example of the deep reference tradition is the fight scene in the Season 5 episode, Cripple Fight. The episode introduces Jimmy Valmer, the disabled stand-up comedian who becomes one of South Park's most beloved recurring characters, and puts him in conflict with Timmy, the existing disabled character, over control of their scout troop. The conflict escalates into a sustained physical brawl in a parking lot. The fight is too long. That's the first thing you notice. It goes on for considerably longer than fight scenes in animated shows normally go minutes rather than seconds, with multiple phases, brief pauses for exhausted breathing, comebacks, and reversals. There's something oddly committed about it. Something that feels like the show is spending more time and animation on this specific sequence than you'd expect, given that the rest of the episode uses its budget in the usual economical way. If you've seen John Carpenter's 1988 science fiction film, They Live, you understand why. They Live is a film about a drifter who discovers sunglasses that allow him to see that corporate advertising contains subliminal messages of control and that many authority figures are actually alien beings. The film contains an alley fight occurring when the protagonist tries to get his friend to put on the sunglasses, and the friend refuses, escalating into a brawl that is one of the most discussed action sequences in cult cinema history. It lasts several minutes. It has multiple phases. It involves the same basic comic structure as the South Park version. One person trying to get the other to accept something they don't want. The refusal becoming physical, the violence extending well past the point where the narrative requires it. Parker and Stone rebuilt the fight shot for shot. The camera angles in Cripple Fight mirror the camera angles in the They Live alley fight. The pauses in the action, The moments where the two combatants simply stand breathing and collecting themselves before resuming occur at the same structural positions. Even the inciting object Timmy wants Jimmy to wear a hat instead of sunglasses echoes the specific object of the original's dispute. If you watch They Live and then watch Cripple Fight, the reconstruction is unmistakable. If you only watch Cripple Fight, it's still funny, because the length and commitment of the fight is amusing in itself. But the second layer, the recognition layer, transforms the sequence from a funny joke about disabled children fighting in a parking lot into a genuinely sophisticated piece of filmmaking, a conversation between two pieces of cinema across 13 years. A Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick's 1971 adaptation of Anthony Burgess's novel, provides a visual language for some of South Park's darkest Cartman moments. In Season 14's Coon 2, Hindsight, Cartman, in his coon superhero persona, turns on his allies and attacks them. The shots during this sequence mirror the scene in A Clockwork Orange, where Alex attacks his droogs, the same angles, the same staging, the same progression. Alex is a charismatic young sociopath who maintains his dominance through sudden violence directed at the people closest to him. Cartman occupies a remarkably similar narrative position in the South Park universe, and the visual citation of the Kubrick film acknowledges this kinship explicitly, at least for viewers who recognize it. The Shining, Stanley Kubrick's 1980 horror film, makes multiple appearances in South Park, in forms that range from obvious to ambient. The Season 16 episode, A Nightmare on FaceTime, is an explicit Shining parody. Randy Marsh rents a Blockbuster video store and becomes Jack Torrance, descending into isolation and madness while his family tries to navigate a Halloween night around him. The episode reproduces several of the film's iconic visual moments in loving detail, but the reference appears in a less obvious form, much earlier in the show's run. In the opening animation of the Season 1 Halloween episode Pink Eye, the school bus has red drum scrawled on it, murder, written backwards, the word that Danny Torrance writes on the mirror in The Shining. It's there for a fraction of a second in a background shot, referencing one of the most recognizable horror films ever made in a way that most first-time viewers will not consciously register, but that rewards the pause. The Goonies, Richard Donner's 1985 adventure film about children following a treasure map to save their neighborhood, appears in the Man-Bear-Pig episode through Cartman's subplot. When the boys are trapped in the cave and Cartman finds a chest of treasure, he decides to eat it rather than let anyone else have it. This specific behavior, consuming treasure to prevent others from claiming it, mirrors a scene in The Goonies featuring Corey Feldman's character, who similarly eats treasure in his possession, rather than yielding it to antagonists. The Goonies is a film about children on an adventure finding treasure in caves, which aligns so naturally with the general South Park aesthetic that the reference could plausibly be coincidence. But the specificity of the action, the exact narrative beat it mirrors, marks it as deliberate. Night of the Living Dead and its sequels, George Romero's zombie franchise, provide the structural template for the Season 12 episode, Night of the Living Homeless, in which homeless people descend on South Park in zombie film fashion. The episode title announces one reference, but the episode itself reaches beyond it to draw from multiple Romero films. Specific scenes reference Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead as well, with camera angles and staging choices that mirror the earlier films. Viewers familiar with the Romero catalog will recognize multiple specific moments. Viewers who know only the concept of zombie films will get a lesser but still functional version of the parody. Philadelphia, Jonathan Demme's 1993 drama supplies the emotional architecture for parts of the Season 12 episode Tonsil Trouble, which deals with Cartman contracting HIV and the social dynamics this generates. Parker and Stone have cited Philadelphia as a genuine influence on how they approach the material, using the film's framework for thinking about institutional cruelty and individual dignity in the context of HIV, to give the episode some grounding in actual emotional logic beneath the comedy. This is a reference that operates at the level of feeling, rather than visual citation. You'd recognize it not by spotting a specific shot, but by noticing that the episode is engaging with the same emotional questions the film engaged with, taking them seriously beneath the humor. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, Peter Jackson's early 2000s adaptation of Tolkien's novels, provides the scaffolding for the Season 6 episode The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, in which returning a video rental becomes an epic quest when the boys accidentally mix up a Lord of the Rings tape with their parents' pornographic video. The episode is dense with references to the specific films and to the underlying source material. Clyde is named the High Elf of Faragon. The sixth graders who attempt to intercept the boys are treated as ring wraiths. Butters, who watches the pornographic tape and becomes obsessed with it, develops a Gollum-adjacent relationship with the thing, referring to his precious and exhibiting the same possessive degradation that Smeagol demonstrates through the film trilogy. There is also a Council of Nine that governs the proceedings, and its membership is drawn from multiple genre films: Star Wars, The Matrix, The Wizard of Oz, The Chronicles of Narnia, combining franchise mythologies into a single governing body with considerable casualness. Part 8. The Meta Layer. When the show references itself, South Park spent its first decade operating primarily as an episodic show where continuity was minimal and the universe reset between stories. Characters died and returned. Relationships developed and then were quietly renegotiated. The town was demolished and restored as needed. This wasn't laziness or indifference to continuity. It was a structural choice that fit the show's essentially satirical mode, where any given episode was more concerned with its target of the week than with the accumulated history of the universe it was set in. But underneath that apparent indifference to its own history, something was accumulating. Facts were being established. Character behaviors were being documented. A mythology was being built, episodically and without formal architecture, across hundreds of installments. And gradually, starting in the middle seasons and accelerating dramatically through the later ones, the show started mining that accumulated history with increasing sophistication. The 200th and 201st episodes, aired in April 2010, are the most concentrated exercise in self-reference the show has ever produced. As a celebration of the 200th episode milestone, Parker and Stone devised a storyline that required the return of virtually every celebrity the show had mocked across its first 13 years. Tom Cruise organizes them all into a class-action lawsuit against South Park. The assembly of plaintiffs is extraordinary. Martha Stewart, Jared Fogle, Barbra Streisand, dozens of others, each behaving in exactly the way their original South Park appearances had established. For longtime fans, the episode was overwhelming in its density of callbacks, each returning character requiring you to remember their original appearance to understand why their current behavior was funny. But the deepest and most structurally complex callback in those episodes involves a character who had appeared in a single Season 5 episode nearly a decade earlier. Scott Tenorman, the older kid who humiliated Cartman in Scott Tenorman Must Die, appears in episode 200 as an adult, and the story reveals something that retroactively changes the meaning of both his appearance and, more significantly, the Season 1 storyline about Cartman's father. The revelation: Scott Tenorman's father was Jack Tenorman, a member of the 1,989 Denver Broncos. In the Season 1 finale, the mystery of Cartman's paternity was established to involve possibly being fathered by a member of that specific team. In episode 200, the implication is made explicit. Cartman and Scott Tenorman share the same father, making them half-brothers, which means that when Cartman orchestrated the death of Scott's parents and served them to Scott as chili in Scott Tenorman Must Die, he was unwittingly killing his own biological father. This is a retroactive continuity that transforms a standalone Season 5 episode into a piece of mythology that changes the meaning of the Season 1 story. To fully appreciate what episode 200 is doing, you need to remember a Season 1 episode about Cartman's parentage and a Season 5 episode about a chili cook-off that aired nearly a decade earlier. Hold both of them in your mind and understand that they were always connected, not planned as connected from the beginning, but built from existing material in a way that makes the connection feel inevitable once revealed. The show used its own accumulated history as raw material for new storytelling, building on what existed rather than constructing something entirely new. The cafeteria alien poster, "Have you seen me?" Over the gray alien face is the show's most explicit meta comment on its own Easter egg tradition. It's the game acknowledging itself from inside the game, making visible the tradition of hidden aliens through the format of a missing persons flyer, placing the acknowledgement in the background of a room that appears in dozens of episodes. It exists as a thing you're supposed to find, which tells you that there are other things you're supposed to find, which points you back to the tradition the poster is referencing. The Easter egg contains directions to other Easter eggs. It is, in the most literal sense available, a meta Easter egg. The way the show handles its own controversies as material is another form of meta-reference, and one that has operated from the show's very beginning. The Season 1 episode, Death, introduces Terrence and Philip as the flatulent Canadian comedy duo that South Park's parents are horrified by. The joke is that the parents of the fictional South Park are outraged by a crude cartoon, and their outrage mirrors the real-world outrage of parents at the actual show. South Park was parodying the response to South Park within the first weeks of its existence, using the show within the show structure to hold a mirror up to its own controversy, while the controversy was still forming. This self-referential treatment of controversy reaches its logical apex in the Cartoon Wars two-parter from Season 10, in which a fictional version of Family Guy plans to air a depiction of Muhammad, leading to a plot in which the fictional network censors the fictional cartoon's depiction for reasons of fear. The fictional censorship in the story then becomes real. Comedy Central declined to allow the actual depiction of Muhammad in the actual South Park episode, inserting a censorship screen rather than showing the image. The fiction was about a network censoring a cartoon for fear of violent reprisal. The reality was a network censoring a cartoon for fear of violent reprisal. The show's fictional layer and its real production layer collapsed into each other in a moment that feels unprecedented in television history. A story about institutional censorship being subjected to the exact censorship it was, satirizing, in real time, on the network that aired both the satire and its object. Part 9. Background details. You had to pause to see. Some of South Park's most interesting Easter eggs belong to no category other than something small and specific, hidden in a specific frame. These are the purest form of the tradition, deliberate, isolated, placed by someone who wanted to reward the freeze-frame viewer with a brief moment of private discovery. They don't build traditions across seasons. They don't require a knowledge of other Parker and Stone films. They are simply details in backgrounds, placed with care, almost certainly missed by the vast majority of viewers who ever watch the scene they appear in. When Cartman goes online in the Season 4 episode Cartman Joins NAMBLA, the episode in which Cartman tries to make friends with cool older men on the internet and becomes entangled with two very different organizations that share an acronym, he opens his chat client and is immediately deluged with messages. The screen fills so quickly that the individual messages are essentially unreadable at normal playback speed. It's a single-frame burst of information that the show presents as visual noise, representing the chaos of early internet social spaces. But if you pause the video at the right moment, the messages on screen are individually readable, and they are real messages, not placeholder text, not lorem ipsum, but specific, individual, surreal little observations and non sequiturs written out in full, messages that will never be read by anyone watching normally, placed there by animators who wrote out a whole screen's worth of content for a joke that would live in a single frozen frame. The labor involved in this is notable. Nobody made them do it. They did it because the detail mattered to them, even though the audience would almost certainly never find it. In the South Park movie, South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, released in 1999, there is a scene in a hospital emergency room when Kenny is brought in after his encounter with a fire. The scene is brief, a transitional moment before the story moves on. In the background of the hospital, visible on the whiteboard, where staff assignments and patient information would normally be listed, two items reward close attention. One is a note assigning a doctor to disembowel Kenny, which is funny as an in-universe acknowledgement of Kenny's perpetual deaths and the medical establishment's casual familiarity with his fate. The second item is stranger and funnier. It instructs a doctor named No to kill Bond. This is a reference to the 1962 James Bond film, Doctor. No, the very first official entry in the franchise, the one that established the template, encoded into a hospital administrative board in an animated film about construction paper children starting a war over profanity. Someone on the production team placed a James Bond reference in a hospital background detail that would only be discoverable by freezing a scene that lasts less than 5 seconds. The Pink Eye Halloween episode is generously supplied with background details. Principal Victoria's office contains a poster about Puffy the Bear, a parody of Smokey Bear, the fire safety mascot whose long government-backed career has made him one of the most recognizable fictional bears in American culture, which tells you something specific about the show's approach to institutional icons. It also contains a photograph of Kathy Lee Gifford on a shelf behind the principal's desk, which situates Gifford as a background institutional presence in the South Park universe. A figure of ambient authority who is never the episode's subject, but is always quietly present. In the pilot and early episodes, Gifford appears in various background contexts. Her association with family-friendly entertainment culture makes her a useful background icon for the show's universe, and the photograph in Victoria's office is one of the more subtle expressions of this. The episode Volcano, which is the second episode the show ever produced, features Scuzzlebutt, a mysterious Bigfoot-like creature that lives in the mountains above South Park. In the midst of establishing Scuzzlebutt's characteristics, the wicker basket hand, the ability to weave baskets, the general mountain creature demeanor, the episode notes that one of Scuzzlebutt's legs is Patrick Duffy. This is stated directly, not hidden. Patrick Duffy is identified by name as the leg of this creature. The joke requires knowing that Patrick Duffy was the star of Dallas, the primetime soap opera that ran through most of the 1980s, and specifically requires knowing about the famous It Was All a Dream season, the season 8 of Dallas, in which Bobby Ewing, Duffy's character, who had been killed off, was revealed at the start of the following season to have been dreamed by his wife, retroactively negating an entire season of storyline. This is exactly the kind of early 1980s television reference that Parker and Stone's childhood formation was built from, and its appearance as the literal leg of a mountain monster is the kind of absurdist repurposing of television history that the show would go on to do thousands of times. City on the Edge of Forever, a Season 2 episode that is itself a parody of a Star Trek episode with the same title, contains in its flashback sequences a missing poster for Macaulay Culkin. In 1997 and 1998, Culkin was at a peculiar moment in his public career. Enormously famous from the Home Alone films of the early 1990s, no longer working at the same rate, largely absent from the kind of public cultural presence he'd had at his peak. The missing poster captures this specific cultural reality, the child star, as a kind of vanished figure, present in recent memory but currently unaccounted for, and it would only be legible as commentary to someone who remembered the Culkin phenomenon and noticed his absence. It is, in a very specific sense, a comedy about celebrity culture embedded in a background poster that would mean nothing to someone who didn't remember who Culkin was and when he'd been prominent. Part 10. The Sound Layer Musical Easter Eggs and Hidden Audio. South Park's reputation is built on vision, on its construction paper aesthetic, its crude animation, its visual shock comedy, but the show has always been as carefully constructed sonically as it is visually, and the musical intelligence that would eventually produce a Broadway musical and an Academy Award-nominated song was present from the very beginning, operating in forms that most viewers absorbed without noticing. Les Claypool, the bassist and vocalist of Primus, composed the South Park theme for what has been reported as approximately $74. This number is so low that it functions almost as a punchline. The theme music for one of the most financially successful animated shows in television history generated for less than most people spend on groceries in a week. Claypool's particular musical identity, built on complex bass lines, slightly off-kilter rhythmic sensibility, and a vocal style that sits comfortably in the zone between conventional singing and character performance, gives the theme a distinctive quality that most animated series themes don't have. It sounds like a real song made by a real musician with a specific aesthetic, rather than functional background music produced to specification. The unaired pilot version of the theme is slower, the same melody, the same basic arrangement, but running at a noticeably reduced tempo that makes it feel more considered, more deliberate, less driven. When the show was prepared for broadcast, the tempo was increased, giving the theme the slightly frenetic quality it has always had on air. The sped-up version suited the show's energy better, but the slower version survives in the unaired pilot as a document of the music before the choice was made, a before to the after that most viewers know. Side by side, they sound like two different songs built from the same material, which is exactly what they are. The unaired pilot version of the Braniff card also has a different musical quality, because the Spadowinkle melody hadn't been established yet. What plays over the dancing men in that version is closer to an improvised variation, establishing the comedic frame without the specific melody that would become iconic. The Spadowinkle Day melody itself deserves more attention than it typically receives in discussions of the show. Spadowinkle Day is, as a piece of songwriting, a masterwork of weaponized cheerfulness, a song that achieves its comic effect through the absolute conviction with which it presents its simple joy. The sky is blue, and all the leaves are green. The sun's as warm as a baked potato. These are not sophisticated lyrics. They are not meant to be. The comedy lives in the complete earnestness of the delivery, the music that performs genuine delight at ordinary things, the willingness of the song to simply be happy about a nice day with total sincerity. Parker's musical sensibility, which would later produce Les Miserables, influenced Broadway musicals, and Academy Award-nominated film songs, was already fully formed in this student film composition, and the choice to carry it forward into South Park's end card was both affectionate and aesthetically coherent. The one-episode Monkeys variant Braniff melody from Chickenpox represents the only moment in the show's run where that established end card sound was replaced with something different. The Monkeys' I'm a Believer is a song with a very different energy from Spadowinkle Day pop, where the other is folk-adjacent with a rock organ foundation rather than xylophone. Peter Tork composing the variant makes the connection to the original explicit. Why this specific episode? The answer, if there is one, has never been formally provided. It sits in the run as a single anomaly, a one-time variation in a tradition that otherwise held for 9 seasons. The Goth Kids episode opening the complete replacement of the standard theme in Dawn of the Posers is the most fully realized musical Easter egg in the opening credit tradition. The replacement isn't a gag version of the theme, not a sped-up or slowed-down version of the existing melody. It's a genuinely composed alternative, taking the same structural function as the opening and filling it with different content minor key, where the original is major, atmospheric where the original is driving, focused on a completely different cast of characters. It works as its own piece of music, not just as a parody reference. The musical intelligence of the South Park movie rewards close listening in ways that the film's reputation as a crude comedy doesn't always suggest. The film is a genuine musical in the Broadway sense. The songs are load-bearing structural elements of the story, not just interludes, and they're built with an awareness of musical theater history that goes well beyond casual parody. The decision to model the film's structure on Les Miserables is audible in the way melodies are developed and reprised, in the way certain songs function as themes that recur in varied forms throughout the score. Brief Disney citations are embedded in the orchestration and vocal choices. The film isn't just using musical theater as a format, it's in conversation with specific works in that format, and the conversation is musical as well as thematic. Blame Canada, which received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song and was performed at the ceremony in sanitized form, is not just a funny song. The melody is excellent on its own terms, singable, memorable, with a structure that supports its escalating satirical logic. Parker wrote it as a crowd anthem in the tradition of Broadway showstoppers, the kind of song designed to fill a theater and invite participation, and it does that well enough that the Academy voters apparently agreed it deserved recognition alongside the year's conventional film music. Part 11. Prediction. Easter eggs. When South Park saw the future. South Park has an uncomfortable and occasionally eerie relationship with events that hadn't happened yet when the relevant episode was made. The show's 6-day production schedule, which allows it to respond to current events with essentially live speed, also occasionally produces the inverse, a gag or detail that seems innocuous or even generous at the time, but becomes, in light of later real-world developments, something much stranger. The most famous and most uncomfortable instance of this involves Jared Fogle. In the spring of 2002, Fogle was the Subway sandwiches spokesman, a man who had genuinely lost a large amount of weight eating the restaurant's food and had become the face of a long-running advertising campaign. He was a cultural fixture, recognizable, benign, a success story. In the season 6 episode, Jared Has AIDS, which aired on the 6th of March, 2002, the South Park version of Fogle announces that he actually lost weight, not through diet alone, but because he had AIDS, personal trainers, and nutritionists, which everyone around him persistently mishears as AIDS. The episode has a running gag structure built on the misheard word, and it includes jokes about Fogle giving AIDS to children, which at the time of airing was a wordplay joke built entirely on the pun. In 2015, the real Jared Fogle was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted on charges involving sexual abuse of minors. The 2002 episode's punchline about giving AIDS to children was, retroactively, no longer simply a pun. Parker and Stone had no knowledge of Fogle's crimes. Nobody did. The episode was a straightforward wordplay comedy that made a specific joke and moved on. But South Park's habit of taking public figures and pushing their characteristics toward extreme caricature means that the show occasionally produces an exaggerated version of a person that, years later, turns out to have been accurate rather than satirical. When you spend decades writing scenarios in which celebrities and public figures behave in the worst version of their public image, the statistical reality is that some of those worst versions will eventually be confirmed by reality. The Jared situation is the most extreme case on record, but the phenomenon itself is a consequence of the show's method rather than supernatural foresight. The Man-Bear-Pig situation is a prediction Easter egg of a different and more instructive kind. The 2006 episode predicted, through the logic of satire, that climate change concern was overblown, that Al Gore was exaggerating or even inventing threats for personal political benefit. This position, stated plainly and with considerable comedic force in the episode, turned out to be wrong. Parker and Stone knew enough about their earlier position and the subsequent development of climate science to acknowledge this publicly in 2018 when they returned to the character with a season 2-parter in which Man-Bear-Pig is real and devastating, and in which the boys apologize to Gore for having dismissed him. The acknowledgement is itself an Easter egg for viewers who remember both episodes to understand why the boys' apology is the specific correction that it is. You need to hold the 12-year gap between the original mockery and the retraction simultaneously. The show's predictive relationship with internet culture has been more consistently accurate than its political predictions. Episodes dealing with the dynamics of viral content, social media mob behavior, performative outrage, and the economics of internet attention were written during eras when the specific vocabulary for describing these phenomena didn't yet exist. You Have Zero Friends, the season 14 episode that parodies Facebook, aired in 2010, only 4 years after Facebook became publicly available, and it identified dynamics of social media loneliness and quantified popularity that would only become more widely discussed in subsequent years. The episode works as a parody of Tron and also as a genuinely prescient piece of cultural observation about what social media was doing to friendship. The Tweak X Craig episode from season 19, in which the school's Asian students create a fan art ship of two characters who are not actually in a relationship, and which becomes real in the universe as a consequence of the fan energy around it, identified a dynamic in fan culture and shipping communities that was quite specific to internet fandom in the mid-2010s. The episode required enough familiarity with fan fiction, culture, and shipping dynamics to be fully funny, and the culture it described has only become more prominent and more formalized since 2015. Part 12. The Modern Era Post-COVID Specials, Season 27, and Where Easter Eggs Live Now. The post-COVID specials from 2021 represent South Park's most ambitious, sustained Easter egg project in years, perhaps in the show's entire history. Setting the story 40 years in the future gave Parker and Stone permission to build a world that was visually and narratively dense with accumulated reference, the kind of environment that only becomes possible after 24 years of establishing a universe's vocabulary. The future South Park is readable as a palimpsest of everything that came before it, with layers of older material visible through the new story. The Tolkien name revelation deserves its own extended examination because of how it operates as a retrospective Easter egg of a very specific kind. Throughout the show's run, from the character's introduction, the name of Tolkien Black was spelled Token in scripts, production materials, official episode guides, and on-screen text. The spelling Token was the obvious choice, given that the character's reason for existing in the early seasons was to be the show's token black kid, a meta-commentary on representation that was simultaneously progressive in its self-awareness and problematic in its instrumentalization of the character. The character grew considerably beyond this original function over the seasons, becoming a genuinely developed personality rather than a commentary on his own presence, but the name remained. In season 25, the show addressed the spelling directly. Randy has a realization and announces that the boy's name is spelled Tolkien, Tolkien, after the author of The Lord of the Rings. The revision arrives as if correcting a long-standing error, as if the correct spelling was always there and everyone had simply been writing it wrong. Whether this was always the plan, whether the creators always intended the name as a Tolkien reference and the token spelling was a multi-decade misdirection, or whether the Tolkien connection was a retroactive invention, applied to an existing name, is genuinely uncertain. Parker and Stone have not fully clarified their intent. The revision works either way, and it works as an Easter egg because it requires you to look at every past appearance of the character's name and ask whether you were seeing the wrong thing all along, whether the reference was always there and invisible, whether the joke was running for years before it became visible. The post-COVID future is visually constructed through careful citation. The Blade Runner geisha advertisement, appearing on screens above the skyline, is the most prominent of these citations, but not the only one. The general dystopian aesthetic of the future, the neon-lit corporate advertising in the dark, the degradation of public institutions, the normalization of formerly extreme social changes, draws from a visual vocabulary of near-future science fiction that Blade Runner established, but that extends through the genre. The show is placing its characters inside a recognizable visual tradition for depicting futures that have gone wrong, and doing so through specific enough citation that the reference is identifiable rather than ambient. Randy Marsh's paraphrase of the Tears and Rain monologue from Blade Runner is the most direct citation in the specials. The monologue spoken by the dying replicant Roy Batty at the film's conclusion, describing beautiful and doomed memories that will disappear when he dies, like Tears and Rain, is one of the most famous speeches in science fiction cinema. Randy's version, delivered in Randy's characteristic self-focused and partially misunderstood way, preserves the structural elegance of the original while stripping it of its grandeur, transforming genuine pathos into the show's specific flavor of comedy, built on deflating the serious through the small and human. To hear it as the specific reference it is requires knowing the original speech well enough to recognize the structure beneath Randy's self-interested reinterpretation. Adult Clyde in the alternate timeline, walking through South Park wrapped in aluminum foil while the production builds specific music under the scene, is a Terminator reference James Cameron's 1984 film, in which an unstoppable machine from the future walks through the present on a mission of lethal efficiency. The visual choice and the musical accompaniment combine to make the reference clear for viewers who know the film, while the scene functions adequately as comedy for viewers who don't. This double-level functioning, recognizable to the informed viewer, still funny to the uninformed one, is the mark of a well-executed Easter egg. The return of COVID, the second part of the post-COVID story, includes the specific air date of the South Park U vaccination special as an in-universe fact. When Wendy explains to Stan that Kenny was trying to return to the 10th of March, 2021, she is citing the actual real-world broadcast date of that episode. The show's broadcast history has been incorporated into its fictional continuity, its real institutional calendar becoming the show's imagined timeline. This is a move that requires the viewer to know, or to look up, the real dates of South Park's production history, to appreciate that the date in the dialogue is factually accurate rather than invented for story purposes. Adult Butters telling adult Cartman, "Fuck you, Eric," in the alternate future, is a callback to a moment from Season 7's Christian Rock Hard, an episode where Butters makes exactly that statement in exactly that context of standing up to Cartman. The reprise, across 14 years and across the time jump of 40 years, makes it function as a character consistency point. This is something Butters does in moments of genuine defiance, and adult Butters retains the same capacity for it. For viewers who remember the original moment, it's a brief flash of recognition. For those who don't, it's simply adult Butters being assertive, which works on its own terms. Season 27, the season that premiered in July 2025 and drew official White House condemnation within 24 hours, continues the Easter egg tradition in the register that has defined the show's most recent era. Deep continuity, self-citation, structural reference to earlier material. The first episode's depiction of Trump in a relationship with Satan explicitly echoes the 1,999 film's depiction of Saddam Hussein in a similar position. The echo is architectural, the show returning to an established structural vocabulary for depicting figures who wield power through infernal alliance, and it rewards viewers who know the film well enough to recognize that the Season 27 premiere is in conversation with something the show made 26 years earlier. The episode's reference to the Paramount Trump settlement, delivered through Jesus, explaining his contractual obligation to appear at South Park Elementary as a condition of legal resolution, is an Easter egg in the sense of requiring real-world knowledge to decode. The joke works as absurdist comedy. Jesus being contractually obligated to be places is inherently funny, but it also works as specific commentary on the actual corporate legal relationship between Paramount, Comedy Central's parent company, and the Trump administration's legal pressure. To understand the joke at that level requires knowing the details of the actual settlement, which most casual viewers won't, which means the joke functions simultaneously as accessible absurdism and as private commentary for the informed viewer. This is where the Easter egg tradition has arrived after 3 decades. The hidden gray aliens in early season crowd scenes were the beginning. Simple, playful, requiring only the knowledge that you should be looking. The film references and literary numbers were a middle era, more demanding, requiring specific cultural knowledge, rewarding the viewer who brought that knowledge to the screen. The deep continuity callbacks and the real-world knowledge jokes of the current era represent the most demanding form of the tradition, things that only fully function if you bring 28 seasons of South Park history and current event knowledge simultaneously to bear on a 22-minute animated episode. None of this means the show has become inaccessible. It remains, at its surface level, a comedy about crude characters in a crude small town doing crude things. But underneath that surface, the accumulation has continued, the tradition has deepened, the rewards for attention have multiplied. There is still a gray alien hiding behind a tree somewhere, patient as ever, waiting. And there will always be someone who looks. That's the modern era's contribution to the tradition, the densest, most demanding, most self-aware layer the show has ever produced. But the story doesn't end there, because even after nearly 3 decades, even after every callback and every hidden number and every film reference we've walked through tonight, there are entire chambers of this universe we haven't opened yet. Part 13. The Character Consistency Easter Eggs. When background details tell the whole story. There is a category of South Park Easter egg that operates differently from everything else we've discussed tonight. It doesn't require you to pause the frame. It doesn't demand you know a specific film. It doesn't need you to decode a number or recognize an audio cue. It simply requires you to pay attention to the characters themselves, to notice what they're wearing, what's on the walls behind them, what books are on their shelves, and to understand that these details were placed there intentionally, that they mean something specific, and that they've been there for a long time waiting for the attentive viewer to connect them to everything else. This category of Easter egg is, in many ways, the most generous one. It rewards sustained watching rather than encyclopedic knowledge. You don't need to have seen Blade Runner or know Jean Valjean's prison number. You just need to have watched South Park the way someone who truly loves a show watches it with both eyes open, noticing things at the edges, carrying details forward from one episode to the next the way you carry memories. Start with Cartman's room. Eric Cartman, the show's most complex and most discussed character, spends a considerable portion of the series' runtime in his bedroom. It's where he schemes, where he weeps, where he has the private conversations that reveal the gap between his public persona and his interior state. The room is decorated, as children's rooms are, with objects that signal identity, action figures, stuffed animals, the specific objects that tell you who this child is when he's not performing for an audience. On the back of Cartman's bedroom door, in a position that places it in the background of any shot taken from inside the room looking toward the door, there has been an Orgasmo movie poster for 12 consecutive seasons. Not a reference to Orgasmo, not a parody of an Orgasmo poster. An actual prop-quality reproduction of the promotional material for Trey Parker's 1997 independent film, the one he made with Matt Stone on a budget so small that calling it shoestring is generous, the one about a Mormon missionary in Los Angeles who gets cast as a superhero in an adult film and has to navigate the implications of that. The same film whose main character's trophy shows up in various places across the show's run. The same film whose musical themes have been borrowed for end credits and scene transitions in episodes spread across decades. The poster on Cartman's door is a detail that rewards two different kinds of viewer in two different ways. For someone who has never seen or heard of Orgasmo, the poster is simply background decoration, a detail that fleshes out the room without drawing attention to itself. For someone who knows the film's relationship to Parker and Stone's personal history, it's a declaration. It's saying quietly and continuously across 12 years that inside this most personally authored of the show's characters, there is a reference to the project that preceded South Park, that the show lives downstream from a specific independent film, and that the man who created Cartman wants you to know that the film still matters to him. Nobody announced the poster was there. It appeared in the background and remained there, season after season, without comment. Finding it requires scanning the background of Cartman's bedroom shots with the specific knowledge to recognize what you're looking at. And once you've found it, every subsequent shot in that room that shows the back of the door becomes a small private acknowledgement between you and the production. Kenny McCormick's death and resurrection cycle is, at this point, such a well-established piece of the show's mythology that it's almost impossible to experience it as a surprise. Kenny dies. Kenny comes back. The mechanism has been referenced in-universe, lampshaded in dialogue, made the subject of entire plot arcs in the latter seasons. But in the early years of the show, before the mechanism was ever acknowledged within the fiction, the deaths had an Easter egg quality of their own, specifically, the variety of them. Each death was a fresh invention. Kenny died from being crushed by a falling satellite dish. He died from spontaneous human combustion during an episode about spontaneous human combustion, which was the kind of layered comedy that worked on two levels simultaneously. He drowned. He was eaten by rats. He fell down a staircase that shouldn't have been that dangerous, but was. The creativity of the deaths became something fans cataloged with. The same completionist energy directed at the alien sightings, a running list, maintained across season after season, of the specific form each week's death had taken. The deaths were, in aggregate, a kind of encyclopedia of all the ways the world could accidentally kill a small boy in a parka, rendered with the flat matter-of-fact quality of someone filling in a checklist. But the genuinely hidden detail within the death cycle was something that only became visible when you looked across all the deaths at once. The deaths were frequently thematically appropriate to their episode. Kenny didn't just die randomly. He died from causes that connected, often obliquely, to whatever the episode was exploring. In the spontaneous combustion episode, his death was spontaneous combustion. In the alien probe episode, the alien presence was what caused his death. In the chickenpox episode, complications from chickenpox killed him. The random deaths weren't entirely random. The cause of death was, much of the time, an Easter egg embedded in the episode's own subject matter, a final callback to the week's theme that rewarded the viewer who noticed it. The Marsh household, where Stan lives with his parents Randy and Sharon and his sister Shelley, has its own persistent background details that reveal character information for anyone patient enough to scan the walls during family scenes. Randy Marsh's home geology set up the shelves of rock samples, the field guides, the equipment appropriate for someone who actually does work as a geologist, rather than simply claiming to be one, is present in enough background shots to establish that Randy's stated profession is real That the comedy of his frequent incompetence and his various spectacular failures as an adult doesn't erase the fact of his actual career. The Room tells you that Randy is not entirely the disaster he appears to be in most of his storylines. He has a professional life. He has a genuine area of expertise. The background of his house makes the case for his competence in a way none of his on-screen behavior ever quite manages to. Randy's wine rack, visible in kitchen and dining room scenes across the later seasons, is stocked in a way that tracks with his evolving character arc. Randy's relationship with alcohol, particularly wine, goes through phases. The rack reflects this without calling attention to itself. The quantities change, the types change, the organizational system shifts in ways that correspond with where Randy is in his current arc, if you're watching closely enough to notice and remember. It's the kind of background continuity that most productions don't bother with because most viewers don't see it. South Park bothered. Stan's room contains a periodic table poster that has been there since roughly season 4. This is notable because the periodic table poster is precisely the kind of room decoration that a parent would place in a child's room, in the vague hope that environmental exposure to scientific information might produce educational benefit. Stan doesn't appear to have ever looked at it deliberately. It sits on his wall across hundreds of episodes, a monument to parental aspiration, never referenced or discussed, or made the subject of any joke. It's just there. And its persistent there-ness, across so many years of background appearance, turns it into something slightly affecting a small, accurate observation about how children's rooms actually look, preserved indefinitely in animation. Tweak and Craig's relationship arc, which was established in season 19, when the boys of South Park misread a piece of fan art and concluded that their two classmates were a couple, only to have the conclusion become real, is tracked through background details, with remarkable consistency in the seasons after their relationship became canonical. Tweak's artwork, the agitated, abstracted paintings that became a plot point in their origin episode, appears in Craig's room in subsequent seasons. Craig has kept the paintings. This is never mentioned in dialogue. Nobody points to the paintings in Craig's room and says anything about them. They're simply there, in the background of the room, doing what they do, visible to the viewer who knows to look for them and who has paid enough attention to the arc to recognize what they're looking at. The relationship that was built out of a misunderstanding and became real is documented in the background of the bedroom, in the specific art that one character made and the other kept. Mr. Garrison's classroom blackboard is a recurring source of background detail, Easter eggs across the show's entire run. The blackboard is usually covered with something, and the content of whatever's written on it is almost never directly relevant to the episode's primary plot. Garrison writes things on the blackboard. They're usually odd, occasionally suggestive, sometimes completely nonsensical, and occasionally for the viewer patient enough to pause and read genuinely funny in their own right, operating as jokes that function independently of whatever the students are doing in the foreground. The blackboard is essentially a secondary comedy track, visible only if you're watching in a way that most people don't watch. It runs parallel to the main episode, without intersecting it. In several episodes, the blackboard content is a direct reference to something from Garrison's personal life that the episode is building toward. The thing written on the blackboard in the morning foreshadows, obliquely, something that will happen to Garrison by the episode's end. This requires knowing where the episode goes in order to read the blackboard retrospectively as a clue, which means it functions differently on first viewing than on any subsequent one. The first time, the blackboard is background noise. The second time, with the destination known, it becomes a setup the show was doing in the background of every classroom scene all along. Kyle's bedroom, like most of the children's rooms, reflects his character's particular combination of earnestness and anxiety. His bookshelves, visible in enough shots to be cataloged, contain titles that track with the issues Kyle tends to be most passionate about, including texts that correspond with the ethical arguments he makes in episodes that engage seriously with questions of justice and moral responsibility. The books are real books, real titles with accurate spines, placed on shelves that belong to an animated child. Nobody reads these books in any episode. The camera never lingers on them or calls attention to them. They simply exist in Kyle's room, telling anyone who's patient enough to read the spines that the show has thought about what Kyle would actually read, has connected his intellectual character to specific real-world texts, and has placed that connection permanently in his bedroom, where it will sit unannounced for as long as the show chooses to use that set. The collective effect of all these details, the poster in Cartman's room, the paintings in Craig's, the blackboard content, the book spines, the wine rack, the periodic table poster, is to create a show that can be watched on multiple, simultaneous levels. The story runs in the foreground. The character details run in the background. The story talks. The background shows. And the showing accumulates across hundreds of episodes into something that has the density and patience of a carefully constructed world. One where someone has thought about who these people are even in the moments when they're not performing for the camera. Part 14. The Guest Star Easter Eggs. Hidden connections in plain sight. South Park has attracted a remarkable roster of guest voices across its run, and the tradition of embedding Easter eggs within or around those appearances is one of the show's most consistently rewarding layers. The guests themselves are often part of the joke in ways that only become visible when you know something about them, something the show never explains, just assumes, and rewards you for bringing to the screen. George Clooney appeared in Season 1 in the episode Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride as the voice of Sparky Stan's dog, not as a character recognizable as George Clooney, not as a version of George Clooney transplanted into South Park for comedy purposes, just as a dog, doing dog things, voiced by a Hollywood actor then at the peak of his ER fame without any of the episode's narrative acknowledging the incongruity. The joke operated entirely at the level of casting information that only made it into the viewer's brain if they happened to read credits carefully enough to see his name. Clooney played a dog. That's the joke. The show trusted you to find it on your own. Jay Leno was also in that same episode, voice acting. As Sparky as well, in one version of the production, the credit situation got complicated by the nature of how voice parts were distributed, and the whole arrangement was deliberately underplayed because a big deal made of celebrity casting would have defeated the purpose. If the show announced that George Clooney was in this episode, voicing this dog, the thing that makes it funny would evaporate. The humor is predicated on the discovery. On coming across the information and having a delayed reaction, wait, what? That person played a dog? When did that happen? Jay Leno returned as himself much later, in contexts where the show was more explicitly using his public persona. But the original Sparky appearance represented the template the show would use repeatedly. Celebrity presence that is real and verifiable, but designed to be encountered rather than announced. Elton John appeared in Season 1's Chef Aid and was given the task of singing a serious, extended musical number that took itself entirely at face value within the episode's parody context. The episode was built around the music industry and legal battles, and the way the powerful use legal mechanisms to crush the powerless. And Elton John's presence was funny on one level simply because he was there, but on another level his performance was genuinely good. Musically, he committed to the material, delivered it with real engagement, and the result was something that worked as both parody and as actual music. For viewers who knew Elton John primarily through his arena rock and stadium spectacle history, this was him at an unusual scale, doing something both smaller and stranger than his usual register. That incongruity was the Easter egg. His being there, and his being good at it, in that context. Radiohead in Season 5's Scott Tenorman Must Die is perhaps the most perfect guest appearance in the show's history as an Easter egg mechanism. In that episode, widely considered one of the show's masterpieces, Cartman orchestrates an elaborate, genuinely disturbing revenge against the older boy who sold him pubic hair. The revenge culminates in a confrontation that involves Radiohead arriving as Cartman's promised reward to Scott Tenorman. Radiohead, the real band, playing themselves, arriving in South Park to make Scott Tenorman cry. Their presence is treated as a completely natural occurrence within the episode's reality, as though South Park were the kind of place Radiohead might casually visit, and the joke works because their presence is simultaneously real. This is actually Tom York's voice, and absurd. Why would Radiohead be in South Park? But the Easter egg embedded within that premise is the specific observation about Radiohead that the show makes when Scott cries in front of them. York says that this is the saddest thing he's ever seen, and the rest of the band agrees. They're moved by Scott's anguish. This is a precise observation about the emotional register of Radiohead's music, the band known for depicting melancholy and alienation in extremely beautiful ways, is also, according to this joke, genuinely susceptible to real-world sadness. The Easter egg is a character insight dressed as an absurd gag. You only get the full resonance of it if you know Radiohead well enough to recognize why their particular susceptibility to sadness is funny. Robert Smith of The Cure appeared in Mecha Streisand, Season 1, battling a giant Barbra Streisand in the form of a kaiju, a Godzilla-style creature, because The Cure is Robert Smith's band, and Robert Smith is famous for a specific kind of aesthetic, sadness, and placing him in a giant monster battle in a Colorado mountain town is the specific incongruity that makes the joke work. Smith committed to the role with evident enthusiasm, which improved the bit considerably. His willingness to participate in the absurdity with full sincerity is itself part of the joke. The Easter egg is the knowledge that this is the man whose musical output defined a particular kind of devoted sadness, and he is here destroying a giant Streisand. Blink 182 appeared in Season 5 and were made the subject of a joke whose punchline required knowing something specific about their creative process, specifically the perception, accurate or not, that their lyrics tended toward a particular flavor of adolescent confusion about sexual experience. The joke played on the gap between their public image as irreverent, punk-influenced pop rock and the specific type of juvenile sincerity that image was built on. To understand why it's funny to put Blink 182 Inches that specific context requires already knowing something about Blink 182 that the episode never explains, trusting the viewer to bring it. This patterns celebrity guests whose presence is layered with unstated information that the viewer must supply runs throughout the show's guest casting history. Randy Quaid appeared in ways that referenced his personal legal history. Bill Hader voiced characters whose specific comedic timing and delivery were in conversation with his Saturday Night Live work. The appearances are Easter eggs as much as they are guest shots, because the joke frequently lives in the gap between who the person is in real life and what they're being asked to do in the episode, and that gap is only visible to viewers who show up knowing who the person is. Some guest appearances are Easter eggs in the most literal sense. They're hidden. A-list celebrities whose voices appear in background crowd characters, uncredited in the episode's marketing, findable only by recognizing the voice if you're paying close enough attention and then going to the credits to confirm your suspicion. The show has done this multiple times across its run, and the specific instances have become the subject of the same kind of dedicated fan detection that alien sightings inspire someone, claiming a crowd voice sounds like a specific actor, a community debating whether that identification is real or a resemblance, occasional confirmation arriving from inside the production months or years later. The guest appearance tradition also has a shadow version, celebrities who declined. South Park has been public about specific rejections, typically because the response to the rejection became funnier than the appearance would have been. The running lore around who said no to South Park and why, and how the show responded to the no, is itself a kind of Easter egg for fans who've been following the show's cultural presence over decades. Michael Jackson's complicated relationship with the show, appearing in a long-running subplot under a pseudonym, the show commenting on him for years, the subsequent revelations about his life, making those portrayals carry entirely different weight, is perhaps the most substantial instance of this shadow tradition. A guest who was never quite a guest, but whose presence and absence structured multiple episodes. The guest star Easter eggs represent the show's engagement with its own cultural moment. The aliens and the numbers and the film references are about private enthusiasms about Parker and Stone's own histories and tastes, expressed in hidden form for the viewers who share those histories. The guest star layer is about something more public. The show's position as a commentary on the culture it inhabits, using real people whose public identities are material for that commentary, and embedding the commentary in the gap between who those people are and what the show does with them. Part 15. The geography of South Park, a town that hides its own history. There is a version of South Park scholarship that bypasses the Easter eggs entirely, the numbers and the aliens and the film references, and focuses instead on the fictional town itself, its geography, its architecture, the buildings that appear and disappear between seasons. The establishments that have been present since the first episode and the ones that were added later. The town as a place, with the specific history and continuity that a real place would have, maintained with varying degrees of precision across nearly 3 decades of episodes. This is, for certain kinds of viewers, the richest territory of all. Because the town of South Park, Colorado, does not behave the way most animated show locations behave. Most animated locations are sets, a fixed collection of backgrounds that exist to give characters somewhere to stand while they have the conversations the plot requires. They don't accumulate history. They don't change in response to events. Springfield in The Simpsons is famously elastic. It expands and contracts to accommodate whatever story needs to be told, contains harbors and deserts and nuclear plants in whatever configuration the episode demands, with geography that has little to do with geography and everything to do with narrative convenience. South Park's town has more internal consistency than that, and the places where its consistency breaks are themselves interesting. They reveal which details the production considered worth maintaining and which it was willing to sacrifice to storytelling needs. The town is a record of what the show thought mattered. Skeeter's Bar and Cocktails is perhaps the most precisely maintained establishment in the show's fictional geography. It has appeared across nearly every season in the same general location with the same rough external appearance, serving the same narrative function as the town's working-class adult social space. The bar is where Randy Marsh gets into fights. It's where the adult male residents of South Park end up when the episode's story pushes them toward community confrontation. It has, in its visual consistency across time, acquired a kind of institutional weight. It is one of the places South Park has that feels like it has always been there. The bar's interior has changed more than its exterior over the years, and tracking those interior changes the bar counter, the pool table. The specific arrangement of the space across seasons is one of the quieter pieces of background research that some fans have conducted. The changes are small but real. The space has been redressed multiple times. What this means is that the show paid enough attention to the interior to keep reimagining it, rather than simply using the same fixed background indefinitely. The bar exists in a state of slow renovation, visible only to viewers who've been inside it enough times to notice the differences. The school South Park Elementary maintains a more rigorous internal consistency than almost any other location in the show's geography. The hallways, the cafeteria, the gymnasium, Mr. Garrison's classroom, the principal's office. These spaces have a stable enough architecture that they function as reliable spatial containers for the show's recurring institutional comedy. When something changes in the school, when a wall gets repainted, when the cafeteria layout shifts, when a new poster appears in the hallway, it tends to track with the show's narrative reality at that point. The change corresponds to something that happened in the fictional world. The alien poster in the cafeteria, the one that says, "Have you seen me?" has been present long enough that it has become part of the school's permanent architecture in the minds of devoted viewers. It's as much a fixture of the cafeteria as the lunch counter or the tables. The fact that it's an Easter egg, a reference to the show's own hidden alien tradition, has faded into the background of its simple existence as an object in a room. It has become furniture. The town itself has experienced disasters across the show's run that have left marks. South Park has been destroyed, rebuilt, evacuated, infected, invaded, flooded, and otherwise catastrophically affected by numerous plot events. In most animated shows, these catastrophes are entirely reset by the next episode, the damage erased as though it never happened. South Park has been more inconsistent on this point than pure realism would require, but more consistent than simple cartoon logic would expect. Some disasters leave scars. Buildings that get destroyed are sometimes shown destroyed in subsequent episodes. New buildings appear that correspond to construction projects undertaken to replace destroyed ones. The town looks, at various points, like a place that has been through things. The most interesting geographical Easter egg is one that fans discovered through systematic examination of exterior establishing shots across multiple seasons. The mountain that gives the show its opening credits. Backdrop the mountain visible in the standard establishing shot that orients the viewer to the town's location has a specific visual feature that only becomes visible at a particular time of year in the episode's continuous, fictional timeline. The light and shadow configuration on the mountain in shots that correspond to afternoon scenes in winter is slightly different from summer afternoon scenes in ways that are too consistent to be accidental. Someone was modeling the light source with seasonal accuracy, at least intermittently, in the background of a show that wasn't supposed to be operating at that level of geographical realism. The bus stop where the boys wait, at the beginning of each episode, the foundational location, the recurring spatial anchor of the show's entire premise, has had its configuration alter in small ways across decades of use. The stop itself has the same essential elements in every appearance, but the exact positioning of those elements, relative to each other, the precise angle at which the fence behind the stop sits, and the specific look of the road in front of it. These things have shifted enough times. That careful frame-by-frame comparison reveals a location that has been redrawn multiple times, while maintaining enough of its identity that casual viewers perceive it as unchanged. This is, in a way, the purest metaphor for South Park's entire Easter egg tradition. A thing that looks the same to someone watching normally. A thing that reveals its history to someone looking closely. The bus stop has been through something. It's still the bus stop. It always will be. And the story of what it's been through is written in the small differences between how it looked in 1997 and how it looks now. Differences you'd only ever notice if you'd been watching for a very long time and had started paying a specific quality of attention to the corners of familiar frames. The town of South Park is a place that hides its own history in its geography. It has been watching you as long as you've been watching it. The mountains behind the town, the permanent Colorado background, are the same mountains that surrounded that very first alien hiding in that very first episode, and they've been watching all of this accumulate. Part 16. The language beneath the language. Coded messages and hidden text. There is a category of South Park Easter egg that operates at the intersection of two things the show is genuinely good at: visual detail and linguistic play. Words that appear on screen in the background of episodes, on signs and documents and computer screens and labels and books and anything that can hold text, contain information that is rarely directly relevant to the episode's story, but is frequently relevant to something to the show's own production history, to a private joke between Parker and Stone, to a specific piece of cultural commentary that the show wanted to make without making it loudly. This tradition of background text Easter eggs is one of the most rewarding for pause and read viewers, because it operates on the assumption that nobody will pause and read. The text exists because someone put it there, carefully, on purpose. It is legible if you look. It is invisible if you don't. In the episode Awesome-O from Season 8, which features Cartman dressing as a robot to avoid punishment and being taken seriously as an artificial intelligence by a defense contractor, the technical documents visible on screens and papers in the contractor's facility contain actual information, not just plausible-looking technical nonsense styled to look real from a distance. Actual information, partially readable if you pause and zoom, that constitutes jokes or commentary in its own right. The specific content of these documents rewards the viewer willing to do the work of actually reading them frame by frame. Most viewers see technical documents. The pausing viewer finds the gag the production put inside the technical documents. Mr. Mackey's counselor office contains documents filed in his desk and on his shelves that, when paused and read during scenes shot in his office, reveal information about South Park students that the show has never disclosed through dialogue. Student psychological profiles. Behavioral records. The kind of institutional documentation that exists in real schools but is never read in full, because reading it fully would be both boring and a privacy violation. In South Park, the documents contain actual content, plausible institutional language that shades into character commentary for the students whose files happen to be visible. This is background writing designed to be recovered by one viewer in 10,000, the one who pauses to read Mr. Mackey's filing system. The books on Cartman's mother's shelf, Leanne Cartman, whose complicated relationship with motherhood and her own personal history forms a recurring background thread through the show's entire run, include titles that comment on her situation with the kind of deadpan understatement the show deploys when it wants to say something without quite saying it. The titles are real enough to read if you pause, specific enough to carry meaning if you recognize them, and positioned far enough in the background to be easily ignored by someone not actively looking. Shop signs throughout the town contain puns and wordplay that only become visible when you're reading signs rather than watching the story. A business in the background of a street scene will have a name that makes a specific joke visible only to the viewer who happens to be scanning the street's background instead of following the characters moving through the foreground. The town is, in this reading, plastered with jokes that exist purely for the person who slows down enough to see them. A running comedy track built into the architecture, available only to the patient. A specific tradition within this category involves the books and documents Cartman uses in his various schemes. Cartman, across the show's run, attempts an enormous number of projects that require documentation manifestos, business plans, legal filings, organizational charts for the various groups he attempts to found or lead or manipulate. These documents, when they're close enough to the camera to read, contain actual content that is simultaneously appropriate to the document's function within the story and funny in its specific language, in ways the dialogue never acknowledges. The business plan for his various ventures uses real business plan language that, applied to the insane ventures it's describing, produces a specific flavor of dry comedy, available only to the viewer who reads it rather than watching the broader scene. The legalese in his various schemes has the specific qualities of someone who has encountered legal language without quite understanding it, deploying it with slightly wrong confidence, producing documents that look right from a distance and are subtly absurd up close. The credits of South Park episodes also contain hidden text Easter eggs in the form of production credits that are not always accurate, in the ways you'd assume production credits to be accurate. Names have been invented. Roles have been described with unusual specificity or deliberate vagueness. Individual credits have been used as vehicles for inside jokes between production staff, jokes that are visible to anyone who reads the credits, but that only mean anything to the small number of people who know who the named individuals are and what their actual jobs entail. The credits are a site of production humor, operating in a register below the episode's own comedy, behind-the-scenes material, encoded in plain sight. The tradition of hidden text in South Park runs through another avenue that deserves its own moment. The show's early internet-era episodes, particularly those dealing with IM chats and early social media, contain actual readable text in the chat windows that scroll through scenes. This was before the current era of streaming and pause and zoom viewing, when the assumption was that text on screen that moved quickly wouldn't be read. Parker and Stone apparently understood that some people would slow these things down. The chat messages in relevant episodes contain jokes, references, and character insights that have no equivalent in the dialogue. They are a side narrative, running in the text-based communication layer of the episode's reality for anyone who took the time to read them. The NAMBLA episode, specifically, was mentioned in the introduction to this section, but its IM messages deserve fuller treatment here. That episode, Cartman Joins NAMBLA, involves Cartman attempting to find an adult male friend on early internet chat services and encountering the criminal organization of that name. The chat window that appears during Cartman's online search contains readable messages that, if you pause and read them, are deeply inappropriate in a specifically comedic way, appropriate to the subject matter the episode is handling, but also extending the episode's horror comedy further than the broadcast dialogue goes. The text layer does things the audio layer couldn't. The hidden content deepens the episode's engagement with its own difficult material. This whole tradition of coded text and background language represents something philosophically interesting about how South Park conceptualizes its relationship with its audience. Most television operates on the assumption that viewers are watching at the speed the broadcast provides, receiving the content in the form it arrives. South Park has, from relatively early in its history, operated on the understanding that some viewers would engage differently, would slow down, would zoom in, would read the background, would recover the details that normal viewing speed makes invisible. The show built an audience for itself that consumed it that way, and then it built content specifically for that audience, embedded in layers that the normal speed viewer couldn't access. The message in the background text tradition is, ultimately, the same message the alien hiding tradition delivers. Someone thought about this enough to put something here, in this corner of the frame, in this background detail, where most people won't see it. And they did it across decades, without announcement, without reward from any external source, simply because they found the doing of it worthwhile. The show is full of things like this. It has always been full of things like this. Every episode is denser than a single viewing reveals. That patience, the patience of putting something in the background where it will probably never be found, is one of the more quietly remarkable qualities of the show's production culture. It is, in its own way, a form of generosity toward the most attentive viewers, a gift left for the people who care enough to look. Part 17. The emotional layer Easter eggs that hurt. Not all of South Park's hidden details are jokes. Some of them are wounds. The show has always maintained a complicated relationship with sincerity. It built its reputation on irreverence, on the capacity to deflate anything, to refuse the gravity that other cultural objects demanded, to treat the sacred and the serious with the same flat effectlessness it brought to bear on everything else. This is part of why it generated the reactions it did. Sacred cows were not safe in South Park. Nothing was. But that reputation for deflation obscures something important. South Park has always had a genuine emotional core, and that core has expressed itself most fully in the moments when the show's creators chose to encode something personal in the work, rather than announce it. The Easter eggs in this category are not film references or hidden aliens. They are small acts of private emotion, embedded in the text of public entertainment. Isaac Hayes voiced Chef Jerome McElroy, the school cafeteria chef, who served as the children's primary sympathetic adult, their sounding board, their surrogate father in moments when the show wanted to give them access to adult wisdom from the first episode through most of the show's run. He left in season 10, after the show aired an episode satirizing Scientology that Hayes, a practicing Scientologist, found personally offensive. The episode titled Return of Chef in season 10 used archival audio of Hayes' voice, edited together from his previous performances, to give Chef a final episode before his character was killed. The archival audio was edited in ways that produced statements Hayes never made in those contexts. And the episode was widely understood as the show's response to what Parker and Stone viewed as his hypocritical objection to satire, after years of voicing a show that satirized everything. The Easter egg within this fraud episode is not the satire itself, but something quieter, the specific archival lines chosen. Among the chef lines used in the episode's assembly are moments from earlier episodes that, in their original context, were about Chef's relationship with the boys, his affection for them, his care for them, his role as a reliable adult in their unreliable world. Cutting these lines into a context designed to mock and then destroy the character gave those particular audio moments a terrible irony. The love between Chef and the children, expressed in those archival recordings, was being used as the raw material for his dismissal. Whether this was intentional commentary on the loss of that relationship, or simply the result of choosing the most recognizable Chef audio available, the effect is the same. A hidden layer of sadness running underneath an episode that presents itself as satire. The episode You're Getting Old from season 15 is the show's most emotionally raw episode, and it contains an Easter egg that only reveals itself gradually as the episode proceeds. The episode is a realistic depiction of depression, of the way cynicism and disillusionment can corrode a person's ability to find anything genuinely good, of the specific misery of seeing everything as excrement, when everyone around you still manages to find value in the world. Stan Marsh, having turned 10 and experienced a sudden and inexplicable shift in perception, cannot hear or see anything without perceiving it as literal waste. The music sounds like excrement. The food looks like excrement. Everything is excrement. The episode was widely read at the time of its broadcast as a statement by Parker and Stone about their own relationship with the show, about creative exhaustion, about the difficulty of maintaining genuine feeling after decades of making something, about what happens to the capacity for enthusiasm when you've been producing content professionally for 15 years. Whether this reading is correct is something only Parker and Stone know with certainty. But the Easter egg is the Fleetwood Mac song Landslide that plays over the episode's end sequence. The song, about aging and change and the difficulty of knowing when to hold on and when to let go, runs under a montage of the Marsh family separating Randy and Sharon, deciding on a trial separation, Stan's world still covered in the gray of his new depression, while the lyrics do something the episode's dialogue never quite does: make a direct emotional statement. The song is the episode's hidden heart. It's what the episode actually feels like underneath the scatological metaphor. It's the sincerity that the show's surface wouldn't permit expressed openly, voiced instead through a perfect song choice that functions as an Easter egg for anyone who knows the song well enough to hear what it's saying. The Scott Tenorman must die revelation, that Cartman is Scott Tenorman's half-brother, that he unknowingly murdered his own father in his most celebrated act of revenge, that the elaborate triumph that defined his character's capacity for cruelty was also a profound self-destruction, lands differently depending on whether you pick it up in the initial viewing of episode 200 to 201, or piece it together from the scattered hints that existed before those episodes. The hints were there, in retrospect. The episode that introduced Scott Tenorman in Season 5 contains details that become, in light of the Season 14 revelation, deeply differently charged. Rewatching Scott Tenorman Must Die, after knowing the full story, is an experience that has no equivalent in any other animated show. The triumph you watched is also a tragedy. The victory is also the exact thing Cartman would have wanted to prevent if he'd known. The Easter egg is the entire reframing of a beloved episode into something darker and more terrible than it appeared. Finding it requires watching both things and holding them simultaneously. The death of Miss Choksondik in Season 6, which happened largely off-screen and was treated by the episode with the show's characteristic flatness about death, contained a detail that became an Easter egg posthumously. The character's cause of death, described in the autopsy, involved a quantity of a specific substance that, given the character's established personal history and her relationship with Mr. Mackey, told a story the episode never told in dialogue. The medical detail was placed in the background of a scene involving the autopsy report, readable only if you paused during the scene, and it was a story, a complete narrative arc, summarized in clinical language about two characters' relationship. Hidden in an autopsy report, in a scene that was nominally about something else entirely, the show put a relationship story in a coroner's document and left it there. These emotional Easter eggs, the ones that hurt rather than amuse, are the tradition's most intimate expression. They are the things the show's creators wanted to put into their work that the work's public register wouldn't accommodate. South Park makes people laugh. It makes people uncomfortable. It makes people angry. What it doesn't often, in its surface presentation, do is move people in the straightforward way that art announces when it intends to move you with swelling music and slow camera movements and meaningful dialogue and all the conventional grammar of emotional storytelling. But the sincerity is there. It's in the Fleetwood Mac song at the end of You're Getting Old. It's in the archival chef audio that carries affection into the episode, meant to dismiss him. It's in the hidden story in the autopsy report. It's in the revelation that the show's greatest villain act was also an act of unwitting self-destruction. The emotional layer is the hardest one to find, because it requires more than knowing where to look. It requires a kind of attention that is also a kind of care, a willingness to take the show seriously enough to look for what it genuinely means, rather than what it presents itself as meaning. And when you find these things, when you catch the Fleetwood Mac lyrics arriving at exactly the right moment, or when you recognize the specific devastation of the Tenorman revelation landing on a rewatch, the experience is different from finding an alien in a crowd shot. It is closer to the feeling of discovering that something you loved has been loving you back, quietly, in ways you hadn't noticed until now. Part 20. The long game Easter eggs that took decades to complete. There is a final category of hidden detail that deserves its own space at the end of this survey, because it operates at a scale that no other tradition in the show reaches. Not single-episode Easter eggs, not season-long callbacks, payoffs that were planted and then left alone for a decade or longer before the show returned to collect them jokes and references and structural choices that only became fully legible years after they were made, through the accumulation of subsequent episodes that hadn't been written yet when the seed was first planted. This is the category that makes South Park genuinely unusual among long-running shows. Most entertainment, even very good entertainment, doesn't think this far ahead. The economic realities of television production, the uncertainty of renewal, the impossibility of knowing whether the specific character or detail you're investing in now will still be available in 10 years, All of this pushes against the kind of long-game planning that these Easter eggs require. And yet, across the show's nearly 3 decades of production, certain details were planted and then waited, patient, as the alien in the background, for the episode that would reveal what they'd been doing there all along. The Cartman to Norman revelation is the most structurally ambitious of these long-game Easter eggs, but it's worth returning to here in the context of its full timeline. Scott to Norman Must Die aired in July 2001. The episode in which the revelation arrives, the detail that Jack to Norman, Scott's father, was also Cartman's biological father, making Scott his half-brother, making Cartman the unknowing killer of his own father, didn't air until 2010. In the 200th episode of the series, 9 years elapsed between the setup and the payoff. 9 years during which the earlier episode existed as a celebrated piece of television in its own right, complete, satisfying, seemingly self-contained, carrying a secret that would only become visible nearly a decade later. Parker and Stone either planned this connection from the beginning, or recognized the opportunity it created and retroactively constructed it in a way indistinguishable from having planned it. Either interpretation makes it remarkable. The 9-year span makes it unprecedented in the context of animated comedy. The token Tolkien correction has a different kind of long-game quality. Token Black, the show's solitary black student and one of its recurring background characters, was introduced in the show's early seasons and named in a way that was itself a joke, a comment on the tendency of television to include exactly one black character as a representative presence. A token inclusion, a gesture toward diversity without genuine engagement. The name was the show's satire of its own medium's habits. The character was, by the coding, embedded in his name, the show acknowledging what it was doing while doing it. In season 25, the show revealed that the character's name was actually Tolkien, spelled like J-R-R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, and that everyone, including the viewers, had been mishearing and misspelling it for 24 years. The correction was delivered with the show's characteristic deadpan, as though the error had simply been everyone's mistake rather than the show's deliberate choice. And here is the long-game Easter egg. Whether or not the show actually intended the Tolkien spelling from the beginning, whether this was planned 24 years ago or invented in season 25 as a retroactive reframing, is genuinely unverifiable from the outside. The production team has not disclosed the answer definitively. The ambiguity is, itself, part of the joke. The show might have been sitting on this for 24 years. It might have invented it in season 25 and rewritten the past. The uncertainty is indistinguishable from 24 years of deliberate misdirection, and that indistinguishability is the Easter egg. Butters' darkness has been another long-game accumulation. In the early seasons, Butters was a character defined almost entirely by innocence. The foil to Cartman, the bewildered bystander, the child who could not understand the cruelty of the world around him and therefore kept being surprised by it. His vulnerability was the joke. His optimism was the setup. The punchline was always the world disappointing him again, and his inability to lose the optimism that set him up for each fresh disappointment was what made him endearing and funny simultaneously. But across the later seasons, something accumulated in Butters that the show was careful never to address directly. In episode after episode, in moments that were played as comedy, Butters absorbed experiences that no person, animated or otherwise, should absorb repeatedly without consequence. The manipulation, the exploitation, the specific betrayals that Cartman visited on him with such creative malice, and the various institutional failures of the adults around him, all of it was played for laughs, but it was also being recorded. The show was keeping a ledger. The long-game Easter egg arrived in the form of Butters Stotch, adult. In the post-COVID specials, a version of Butters who had become, across the intervening 40 years of the special's fictional timeline, something genuinely alarming. This Butters had processed his childhood the way people who have experienced that kind of sustained casual cruelty sometimes do, by eventually becoming the thing that was done to him or something adjacent to it. The optimism inverted into something harder. The transformation was not explained in dialogue. It was simply presented as the result of everything the show had done to him across 20-plus years of episodes, the natural destination of that particular trajectory. For viewers who had been watching the whole time, The adult Butters was the payoff of a long game investment, the show finally cashing in the ledger it had been maintaining since roughly season 6. For viewers new to the specials, it was simply a character beat. For those who knew, it was 2 decades arriving simultaneously. The Man-Bear-Pig story, from introduction to correction, spans 12 years as a long-game Easter egg about the show's own capacity for error. The 2006 episode planted an Al Gore's delusional alarmist gag that worked on its immediate terms as satire of celebrity environmental advocacy. It was funny in the way the show intended. It also turned out to be wrong about its object. And 12 years later, the 2018 correction Man-Bear-Pig as real and devastating. The boys apologizing to Al Gore, Gore being characteristically annoying about receiving the apology, closed a loop that most shows would never have been willing to return to. The Easter egg is the willingness to identify the earlier episode as a mistake, in-universe, using the show's own characters, without softening it into anything other than a straightforward correction. Not every show will do that. Almost no show that has been making the same basic argument for 12 years will turn that argument into the thing it's correcting in a later episode. The Randy Marsh character arc is perhaps the longest sustained long-game Easter egg in the show's run. Randy began as a background character, a parent, a scientist, a functional adult whose primary role was to give the children access to the adult world when the story required it. His first several seasons of existence were essentially reactive. Randy showed up when the plot needed a parent, provided whatever function that required, and disappeared back into the background of South Park's adult population. The slow transformation of Randy into a co-lead, and eventually a character whose storylines frequently paralleled or even eclipsed the children's in scope and emotional weight, was an accumulation rather than a declared, unquote, shift. No episode announced that Randy was being elevated. He simply kept getting more material, and the material kept demanding more of Parker's performance, and the character kept becoming more specific and more richly characterized. And by the time the show had been running for 15 or so seasons, it was clear that Randy Marsh was a central figure in an ongoing portrait of a specific kind of American man, talented and self-deceived, capable and irresponsible, genuinely loving and chronically failing. The people that love requires him to show up for. The long-game Easter egg in Randy's arc is in the way his early background appearances, if you watch them knowing what Randy becomes, already contain the character he would be. The specific quality of Randy's self-presentation in early crowd scenes, the confidence, the slightly inflated sense of his own authority, is visible in the background before it was ever developed. Parker was consistent, without having declared the consistency. The character you see in the later seasons was always there in embryonic form, waiting to be found in the crowd. PC Principal, introduced in season 19 as an apparent villain, a humorless enforcer of political correctness. The embodiment of everything the show had been critiquing about identity politics and outrage culture underwent a long-game revision that extended across 4 or more seasons. His initial episodes presented him as uncomplicated, the satirical target, the new kind of authority figure whose enforcement mechanism was social shame rather than institutional punishment. The show seemed clear about what it thought of him and what his function in the narrative was. But across subsequent seasons, PC Principal was gradually humanized. He developed a relationship, he revealed vulnerabilities, he demonstrated, in specific situations, that the values he enforced were not entirely hollow, that behind the performative and often counterproductive enforcement style, there was genuine concern for actual people being actually harmed. He became a person rather than a type. The long-game Easter egg is the retroactive recontextualization of his early episodes, which were themselves comedically sound, but which, read in light of who he became, look like the beginning of a portrait rather than a completed satirical caricature. Finding this requires going back. It requires watching his first season, knowing what he becomes, which is the precise quality of attention the long-game Easter eggs reward. The Garrison as Trump storyline, which began years before the 2016 election, and then became something entirely different when the election's result changed the real world, is a long-game Easter egg that was partially created and partially discovered rather than entirely planned. Parker and Stone have been consistent that they did not anticipate the actual Trump victory when they first began developing Garrison's political trajectory. What they created became something it wasn't designed to be. through the particular coincidence of their fictional political character's arc, aligning with real-world political events in ways that retrospectively looked like prescience. The Easter egg here is not about authorial foresight, but about the relationship between fiction and the reality it inhabits. The way a show rooted in the present moment can accidentally produce something that looks like prophecy when the present keeps moving in directions the fiction had already mapped. All of these long-game details share a common quality that distinguishes them from the other Easter egg traditions we've discussed. The hidden aliens require only spatial attention, looking in the right part of the frame. The film references require cultural knowledge. The literary numbers require outside research. But the long-game Easter eggs require time. Specifically, they require the kind of time that only comes from having watched the show for years, having accumulated episodes, having carried the residue of earlier seasons into current ones. They reward the viewer who has been here for the whole conversation, rather than just dropping in, who has stayed through the seasons that weren't as strong, and the experiments that didn't work, and the controversies that generated more heat than light, who has accumulated enough context to hear the later episodes resonating against the earlier ones. There is no shortcut to these Easter eggs. You can't look them up in a guide and fully experience them, not because the guides don't exist, but because the experience of the payoff depends on the weight of everything that came before it. 24 years of mishearing a character's name is not recoverable from a description. 9 years of not knowing what you did to your own father can't be summarized in a way that captures what it feels like to remember the earlier episode while watching the revelation. The long-game Easter eggs require the long game. They are, in that sense, the most demanding and the most generous of all the show's hidden traditions. They ask the most of you, and they give the most back. South Park is, at its most fundamental technical level, a voice performance. The animation is deliberately simple. The character movement is limited by design. The humor and the emotion and the characterization are carried almost entirely by the voice performances, which means the performances are doing an enormous amount of work, and the choices made in those performances, which voices get used, by whom, in what context, contain their own Easter egg tradition that is just as rich and just as layered as anything you'd find in the background of a frame. Trey Parker and Matt Stone voice the vast majority of the show's recurring characters between them. This is, on one level, a production reality. A small team, a 6-day production schedule, no time for extensive casting. But it's also a creative choice that has produced something remarkable, a universe in which almost every voice you hear comes from one of two people, both of whom are also writing and directing and producing simultaneously. The whole thing is inflected with a single pair of sensibilities. Every character is, in some sense, Parker and Stone in conversation with themselves. The Easter egg tradition within the voice layer begins with the way specific character voices migrated across the show's history. Parker's voice for Cartman in the earliest seasons, the pilot and the first episodes, was slightly different from the voice that became canonical. It was rawer, more obviously performed, with the fake pomposity cranked higher than it would later be. As the character settled into himself over the first 2 seasons, the voice settled with him, finding the specific register that has persisted for nearly 3 decades. Watching the pilot and an episode from season 15 back to back, you can hear the voice finding itself, the Easter egg being the small sonic evidence of a character's evolution, recorded in the archive. Randy Marsh was not originally conceived as a major character. He appears in early seasons as a background parent, a functional adult presence when the story needed one, without any particular definition. Parker's voice for Randy in those early appearances is noticeably flatter, less committed, lacking the specific quality of barely suppressed self-importance that would later define the character's every utterance. As Randy grew into a co-lead, the voice grew with him. The Easter egg for listeners who track this across seasons is the precise moment, somewhere in the middle run of the show, when Randy's voice acquired its full character, when you can hear that Parker has found the thing that makes Randy Randy, and the character stops being a background adult and becomes one of the show's central comic instruments. Butters Stotch, the show's most beloved secondary character, has a voice history that is itself a story about creative discovery. In the earliest episodes featuring Butters, before the character had been named or developed, Parker was using a slightly different vocal quality, still high, still slightly wavering, but not yet possessing the specific combination of sincerity and bewilderment that defines the character at his best. The voice refined itself across multiple episodes until it arrived at the Butters voice as it currently exists, a sound that manages to convey complete earnestness and complete vulnerability simultaneously, with an optimism that has been beaten repeatedly by the world and keeps reasserting itself because Butters simply doesn't know how to be otherwise. Finding the episodes where the voice was still becoming itself is a specific audio Easter egg available only to people who've listened closely enough across enough episodes to hear the difference. Wendy Testaberger has been voiced by multiple people over the show's run. The character went through several different voice actresses, and the transitions between them are audible if you watch episodes from different eras, back to back. Most viewers absorbed these transitions without registering them because the character's animation and behavior remained consistent. The voice was the only thing that changed, and because the changes happened during season transitions rather than within seasons, they fell into the space between viewing sessions where memory is imprecise. But listening closely, the different voices carry subtly different emotional registers for the character. Wendy, in the early seasons, has a quality the later versions modulate differently. The character stayed the same. The voice remembered her differently across the years. The specific phenomenon of Parker voicing female characters in ways that played with conventional expectations about voice and gender is itself an Easter egg tradition not hidden in the obvious sense, but operating in a register where most viewers simply accepted the voice as the character, without analyzing how the voice was constructed. The mayor of South Park, voiced by Parker in the show's standard female register, has a specific quality that functions on one level as conventional performance and on another level as quiet commentary on the relationship between public authority and performed competence. The mayor sounds authoritative. The mayor also sounds, to the careful listener, like someone performing authority, like someone who has studied what authority sounds like and is reproducing it with approximate fidelity. This ambiguity is either intentional characterization or the natural consequence of Parker voicing a character type he's not embodying from the inside. Both explanations make it interesting. Some of the most rewarding voice Easter eggs are the ones involving characters who interact with characters voiced by the same person. Parker playing both Cartman and Butters in scenes where Cartman manipulates Butters is, on a technical level, one person playing both the predator and the prey of a specific dynamic. The Easter egg is the way that technical reality inflects what you hear. Parker constructing both sides of a relationship, giving each side its full character, maintaining the distinction across an entire scene without letting one voice bleed into the other. The discipline of that is considerable. The fact that it goes unnoticed is a testament to how fully inhabited both characters are. Stone's voice for Kyle carries a specific quality of moral seriousness, a weight in the earnestness that distinguishes Kyle from the children around him, a sound like someone to whom things genuinely matter in a way they don't quite matter to the others. Stone has said in interviews that Kyle is the character he finds most personally sympathetic, and that sympathy is audible in the voice. The Easter egg for listeners is the way Kyle's voice in moments of genuine moral argument has a slightly different quality from Kyle's voice in comedic contexts. Not a different voice, exactly, but a different degree of commitment within the same voice. The performance has layers that only emerge when the writing asks for them. The most surprising voice Easter egg in the show's history is probably the fact that Isaac Hayes' chef lines, harvested from archives and assembled into the final chef episode, are recognizable as archival assembly to anyone who knows Hayes' voice well enough to hear the micro-discontinuities in the editing. The joins between different original recordings are mostly invisible at normal listening speed and with normal audio attention. At closer listening, with the specific knowledge that you're hearing edited archive rather than new recording, the seams become perceptible moments where the audio environment shifts slightly, where Hayes' vocal position relative to the microphone changes between words, where the emotional register of one harvested phrase doesn't quite match the register of the one that follows it. The whole episode, for this kind of listener, is an audio Easter egg, a sonic artifact of the show's most contested departure, the record of a loss assembled from recordings that predate the loss and placed in a context that those recordings never anticipated. Kenny's voice, the muffled performance delivered through Parker's own hand, held against his mouth, has its own internal grammar, that rewards close listening across episodes. The muffling is consistent, but Kenny's vocal emotional quality varies. He sounds excited in some episodes and subdued in others. He sounds frightened before his deaths and resigned in others. The content of what he's saying is never recoverable from casual listening, but the emotional shape of his delivery is often legible if you're paying attention. The muffled line at the episode's beginning, the one that changes between seasons, has a specific performance quality to it. It's sung with apparent relish, with something that sounds like genuine comedic investment in the content of a lyric no one can understand. Parker delivering a vulgar song lyric with maximum performance commitment into complete unintelligibility is itself a small, recurring Easter egg, the full theatrical commitment to a joke that almost no one gets. Part 19. The animation layer. What the artists left behind. South Park's animation has always been deliberately crude. That crudeness was a choice from the beginning, a decision to maintain the visual aesthetic of the original construction paper Spirit of Christmas short, even after the show moved to digital production. The look of limitation was, paradoxically, more labor-intensive to maintain than simply animating more fluidly. You have to work to keep something looking rough when you have the tools to make it smooth. Someone had to decide, episode after episode and season after season, that the simpler visual register was worth defending. Within that deliberately simple visual language, the artists who worked on the show developed their own Easter egg tradition, a set of recurring visual motifs, private jokes embedded in the animation itself, specific choices in how things were drawn and colored and composed that carry information for anyone attentive enough to read them. The construction paper aesthetic, even in its digital form, has a specific quality in how it handles texture. Flat color fields with hard edges, no gradients in the early seasons. Characters who move in the cut-and-paste manner, of literally cut-and-pasted paper shapes, rather than the fluid organic motion of conventional animation. This visual flatness was the established baseline. Moments that deviated from it were, therefore, significant. Anytime the show's animation suddenly became more fluid, more detailed, more conventionally accomplished, something was happening, a tonal shift, a genre parody, a formal statement. The anime episode Good Times with Weapons from Season 8 is the clearest expression of this principle. In that episode, when the boys imagine themselves with their purchased weapons as genuine ninja warriors, the animation shifts to a highly stylized anime aesthetic, detailed character designs, fluid combat movement, dramatic speed lines, the full visual vocabulary of the genre being cited. The shift is complete and committed enough to work as actual anime parody, rather than simply South Park characters drawn slightly differently. The Easter egg is the mastery of the transition, the same characters, rendered in an entirely different animation language, with the transition between the two languages marking the boundary between reality and imagination within the episode's fiction. To appreciate the Easter egg fully requires knowing the anime aesthetic well enough to recognize that the parody is accurate, that the South Park team actually studied and reproduced the specific visual tics of the genre, rather than simply approximating it. The transition is also reversible. When the fantasy breaks, when the boys' imagined ninja heroism collides with the mundane reality of their actual situation, the animation flips back. The return is jarring in the specific way that waking up is jarring, the detailed world collapsing back into the flat constructed one. The animation makes the psychological experience of the transition legible, without any dialogue commenting on it. The Easter egg is the technique being used to do emotional work. Similar transitions happen throughout the show's run, in less obvious ways. When South Park wants to suggest that a character is experiencing something beyond the ordinary, an altered state, a moment of genuine vision, a fever dream, or a fantasy, the animation often shifts in small ways rather than dramatically. Colors become slightly more saturated, movement becomes marginally more fluid, the frame composition changes in ways that are subtle enough to be felt rather than seen if you're watching at normal speed. These micro-transitions are the animators encoding emotional states into the visual texture of scenes that don't announce their own significance. The show's use of photographic backgrounds, real photographs, used as backgrounds, in episodes that otherwise use the standard flat animation, is a specific formal Easter egg tradition that recurs across the show's run. When a photographic background appears behind the characters, It signals something, usually that the location being depicted is supposed to be outside the show's standard geography, a real-world place of sufficient specificity to require the visual marker of photographic realism. The contrast between the flat animated characters and the photographic background is jarring in a way that is clearly intentional, the real world and the South Park world in the same frame, the show acknowledging the gap between them through the visual collision. In certain episodes, the photographic backgrounds carry information that is specific enough to be located in the real world. Actual streets, actual buildings, actual geographic features recognizable to people who know those places. The show set certain storylines in recognizable real locations and used genuine photographs of those locations as backgrounds. For viewers who recognize those photographs, the episode exists simultaneously in the South Park universe and in a specific real place, a geographical Easter egg accessible only to people who happen to know that particular street or building or landscape from their own experience. The character designs themselves contain Easter eggs that operate across long timescales. Specific characters who appear as background figures in early seasons, figures so minor that they have no names and no dialogue, purely architectural details of crowd scenes occasionally return in later seasons as named characters with developed roles. The retroactive naming of these background figures is a form of Easter egg for viewers who remember seeing them without knowing who they were. The gradual filling in of a world that was always more populated than it appeared. Stan's design has been modified in small ways over the show's run that are visible only in comparison. His proportions shifted slightly between the early and middle seasons. The specific styling of his hat changed in ways that are individually imperceptible but collectively represent a gradual evolution. These changes were never announced or addressed. The character simply looked slightly different at different points in the show's history, the changes accumulating across enough time that no single episode revealed them, but a side-by-side comparison did. Kenny's parka has consistently served as a site of detailed animation that rewards close inspection. The orange fabric, rendered in the show's flat style, has textured details that are more carefully rendered than the animation's overall approach would suggest necessary. The hood's drawstring, the jacket's zipper, the specific way the fabric bunches around his muffled face, these are details that could have been much simpler without anyone noticing. They were made specific. The specificity rewards the viewer who pauses on Kenny's face, rather than simply accepting it as the standard background element it functionally is. The care put into the character who is supposed to be the most casually treated member of the group, the one who dies and comes back without acknowledgement, is itself a kind of hidden statement about the production's boss' feelings for him. Background crowd characters who recur across multiple episodes in the same configuration, the same group of townspeople always positioned together in crowd shots, the same three figures always standing together at community events, are a visual Easter egg about the social geography of the town. Some of these clusters suggest relationships. The three figures always together imply a friendship or a family connection the show never articulates. The couple who appears at every adult gathering suggests an established social presence in the community that goes unnarrated. These implied relationships exist only in the visual patterns of crowd composition, nowhere else in the show's fiction, and they are discoverable only by the viewer who notices, across many episodes, that these same groupings keep appearing together. The animators' own names, in various forms, appear in background details across the show's run. Graffiti on walls, names on mailboxes, business signs with surnames that belong to production staff rather than fictional South Park residents. This tradition of hiding production personnel in the show's geography is one of the most universal Easter egg traditions in animation. Nearly every major animated property has some version of it, but South Park's version is notable for its persistence and its occasional specificity. The specific form of the appearance sometimes matches something about the production staff member being acknowledged. An animator's name appearing in a context connected to their particular work on the episode, a writer's name showing up in a scene their specific script contributed. The most quietly remarkable animation Easter egg may be the one that spans the entire run. The consistent use of a specific color in the show's palette for moments of genuine consequence. South Park's color world is mostly flat and bright and deliberately simple. But in scenes where something irreversible happens, a death that matters, a relationship that changes, a moment the narrative treats as genuinely weighty, there is a recurring color note, a specific shade of gray-blue that appears in the sky or the background, subtle enough to be below conscious perception at normal viewing speed, but consistent enough to be findable once you're looking for it. Whether this was a deliberate choice or an emergent consistency from the animator's intuitions about appropriate color for heavy moments is not knowable from outside the production. What's knowable is that the color pattern exists, that it corresponds to a specific category of scene, and that finding it changes how you see the show's color, transforms what seemed like arbitrary background decoration into a quiet, emotional grammar running through every episode. That grammar color as feeling, animation as emotional state, voice as character psychology is what the animation layer ultimately contains. The Easter eggs are not just trivia. They are the evidence of a production that thought seriously about the tools of its medium, that built meaning into places where no one asked for meaning, that cared about the show as an animated object, rather than simply as a vehicle for dialogue. The rough, childlike surface conceals a system of choices made with intention. Every episode is more carefully constructed than it looks. That has always been the point. That is everything, or as close to everything, as a single survey can hold. Every alien, every number, every film rebuilt shot for shot, every poster on every wall, every muffled lyric, every callback that reached 20 seasons back to catch something nobody remembered planting there. Every prediction that hit, and every one that missed. Every text message in the background of a scene that moved too fast for anyone to read. Every sad song timed to exactly the right moment in a montage that looked like it was simply showing you a sequence of images, but was actually saying something the dialogue couldn't carry. Every moment of private emotion, encoded in entertainment, designed to seem incapable of it, tucked into a corner of a frame or a note in a credit sequence or a name on a background sign, placed there by someone who cared enough to put it somewhere and trusted that someone, eventually, would look in that direction at the right moment. What we've covered tonight represents decades of production culture operating in a specific register that most people never acknowledge when they talk about South Park. The show has a public face that is very well documented. The controversies, the death threats, the White House condemnation, the Scientology war, the Chinese government erasure, the network censorship battles, these are all on the record, extensively analyzed, endlessly relitigated in every cultural retrospective the show generates. The loud story is easy to find. The loud story tells itself. The quiet story, the one running in backgrounds and credit sequences and sound design and the specific color of skies in difficult scenes and the books on shelves that nobody reads aloud and the numbers in dialogue that decode into other stories and the film scenes rebuilt frame by frame and the musical cues borrowed from projects most people never found, is the one that requires the particular quality of attention we've been practicing tonight. It is the story of a production that built meaning into places where no one required meaning, that cared about the show as a constructed object down to its smallest details, that cultivated and maintained, across nearly 3 decades, a tradition of rewarding the viewers who cared enough to look for rewards. It is the story that the show never told about itself, because telling it would have undone it. And it is also worth saying clearly that what makes this tradition remarkable is not simply its existence. Other shows have Easter eggs. Other productions hide things in backgrounds, drop in-jokes into credits, include brief nods to films they admire. What is being described here is categorically different, not in kind, but in magnitude and in duration, and in the genuine seriousness of craft applied to work that will be seen by almost no one. The tradition in South Park is remarkable for its consistency, its longevity, its depth, and its range. It runs from the simplest possible version, an alien behind a tree, to the most complex possible version, a 9-year payoff that recontextualizes a celebrated episode as a tragedy the show had been carrying since 2001. No other animated show in history has maintained a hidden detail tradition at this scale for this long. The gray alien that first appeared in the show's pilot episode is still appearing, still being planted, still waiting to be found, in episodes that aired last year. 28 years of consistent hiding is not an accident or an enthusiasm that faded. It is institutional. It is structural. It is part of what South Park is. Consider what that kind of sustained commitment actually means. The people working on South Park in 2025 are not the same people who first hid aliens in 1997. The production team has turned over many times. New animators, new writers, new technical staff have joined and departed across the decades, and yet the traditions continue. The aliens keep appearing. The background details keep accumulating meaning. The production culture that Parker and Stone established has survived every personnel change and every format shift, and every era of the show's complicated history, and it has reproduced itself in the people who came to work there. The hidden detail tradition is not Parker and Stone alone. It is an institutional value that they created and that others absorbed and extended. That cultural transmission, from one generation of the production to the next, is itself a form of hidden meaning. The show has been teaching its own makers what kind of show it is, and they have been learning, and the tradition has persisted as a result. Think about what that requires from a production. The 6-day turnaround that the show is famous for. Blank page on Monday, finished episode delivered Wednesday night, leaves almost no time for anything beyond the immediate demands of the story. Writing, voice recording, animation, audio mixing, delivery. The schedule is brutal in a way that most television productions never approach. And within that schedule, someone still remembered to place the alien in the background of the crowd scene. Someone still chose the specific book to put on Kyle's shelf. Someone still looked at the blackboard in Garrison's classroom and decided what to write on it. The hidden details required the same resource the show is most famously short on: time. And they kept being made anyway, because the people making the show believed they were worth the time. That belief, the choice to spend a portion of the most pressured production schedule in television on details that will probably never be noticed, is not a trivial thing. It reflects a philosophy about what the work is for. It says that the show is not simply a product engineered to generate a sufficient audience response. It is an object that should be as fully realized as the people making it can manage, down to the corners that nobody required them to fill in. The hidden tradition is, at its deepest level, an argument about the relationship between the maker and the made. The Easter eggs are not for the audience. The Easter eggs are the evidence of what happens when people treat their work seriously, even the parts nobody will see. There is something about this that is worth sitting with for a moment before we close, because it says something true about the relationship between art and attention. The Easter eggs exist, whether or not they're found. The gray Cartman's prisoner number has decoded to Jean Valjean across every episode it appeared in, whether or not anyone ever ran the digits through their knowledge of French literature. The Fleetwood Mac song played over the right montage and said what it said, whether or not any specific viewer heard it as a statement rather than a background music choice. The things hidden in the show were not diminished by being hidden. They were simply waiting. This is, when you think about it, the most optimistic possible theory of creative labor. The idea that putting something into your work with care and intention is worthwhile, even if the care and the intention are never recovered. That the meaning is real, regardless of whether it finds its audience. Parker and Stone and every member of their production team, whoever hid an alien in a background, or placed a specific book on a shelf, or engineered a musical callback, operated on that theory, episode after episode. Across nearly 3 decades, they kept leaving things for the people who would look. South Park has been hiding things in your peripheral vision for 28 years. It has been patient beyond any reasonable expectation. It has trusted that the right viewers would find what was left for them, and it has kept leaving things anyway in the episodes where nobody was looking, and in the ones where everyone was, in the famous seasons and the forgotten ones, in the pilot and in the season that aired last month. The hiding never stopped. The patience never ran out. If you've been with this for the whole night, through every section, every tradition, every layer, from the gray alien in the pilot to the long game payoffs that required decades to collect, then you've done something that required a specific quality of attention, and I hope it rewarded that attention the way this show's hidden tradition rewards the viewers patient enough to bring it. Drop a comment with something in here that landed as genuinely new, something you hadn't caught after years of watching. The discoveries that surprise the longest tenured fans are always the most interesting ones to hear about, Not just because it tells me which details are most hidden, but because there's something genuinely good about learning that a show you love has been doing something for you that you didn't know about. Finding out that a piece of entertainment you've spent years with was more carefully made than you realized is one of the better feelings available to a viewer. South Park has been offering that feeling for nearly 3 decades, and the offer has never expired. And if you want more of this kind of attention brought to the universes that reward it, the shows and films built for the patient viewer who looks at the edges of frames, who listens to the underscore, who reads the background text, the subscribe button is right there, and hitting it costs you nothing. There is still, somewhere in an episode that has aired and been watched millions of times, a gray alien standing in a background that no one has found yet. Patient and still, enormous almond eyes, scanning the foreground where the story is happening, waiting for the one viewer in 10,000 who happens to look in the right direction at the right moment on the right rewatch. And when that viewer finds it, they'll feel what every person who has ever found one of these details feels: the small, private, disproportionate satisfaction of having looked in the right place. The satisfaction of being the kind of person who looks. South Park has been producing that feeling for 28 years, one hidden detail at a time, in every episode, on every background wall, and every crowded screen, and every sound mix, and every frame. It has trusted that the people who look will keep looking, and it has kept leaving things for them to find. And it will keep doing that for as long as the show exists. It has been standing there for decades. It will keep standing there. Good night.